former Navy SEAL came to northern Minnesota to sell a cabin, disappear quietly, and leave his old life behind. But his German Shepherd K9 suddenly abandoned the trail and led him towards something impossible. A massive rusted freighter buried between the trees. The ship had been stranded there since 1987, and everyone in Copperwake believed its story was already over. Then Flint stopped above a sealed lower deck, pressed his ear to the steel, and scratched 3 times. From somewhere deep inside the ship, 3 faint knocks answered back. What Cullen found below would expose a 40-year-old truth and force him to face the mistake he had never forgiven himself for. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. By the time Cullen Archer Vale reached Copperwake, autumn had only begun to touch northern Minnesota. The birches were turning pale gold one branch at a time, while spruce and cedar remained dark and solemn around them. Beyond the forest, Lake Superior flashed blue beneath a clear September sky, so immense that Cullen could sometimes forget he was looking at a lake instead of an inland sea. He had not come for the view. At 43, Cullen had learned not to mistake beauty for a promise. He stood on the porch of his late uncle's cabin with one hand resting against a weathered support post, studying the sagging gutter he would need to repair before the property could be sold. At 6'1", he still carried the broad shoulders and hard, balanced frame of a man who had spent much of his adult life being trained to move fast while carrying too much weight. His olive green field jacket hung open over a red and dark navy flannel shirt. Dark green cargo pants disappeared into worn brown leather boots whose creases had been earned rather than designed. An old military watch circled his left wrist. The face above the jacket collar had become rougher over the years. Angular, sun-browned, deep blue-gray eyes under a slightly furrowed brow. A strong jaw softened only by dark stubble threaded with the first scattered silver. His short dark brown hair remained clipped in the practical military style he had worn for decades, though gray now marked both temples. He looked like a man who knew exactly where he was going. The appearance was misleading. 2 weeks. That was the plan. Clean the cabin, repair what was worth repairing, throw away what was not, sign the sale papers with the real estate agent. Leave Copperwake. He had become good at leaving. Behind him came the soft metallic jingle of a collar. Flint stepped through the open cabin door and stretched in the morning sunlight. The 7-year-old German Shepherd had the compact strength of a working dog rather than the oversized bulk common in show lines. His black saddle lay dark across a dense short coat, while warm tan covered his legs, chest, lower neck, and the sides of his muzzle. His ears stood alert above intelligent dark amber eyes that rarely seemed to look at just one thing at a time. A simple coyote brown working harness wrapped his chest and shoulders, worn smooth at the edges from years of use. Flint looked toward Cullen, then toward the forest, then back at Cullen. No, Flint's ears lifted another fraction. Cullen sighed. That wasn't an invitation to negotiate. The dog walked down the porch steps. Cullen watched him go. That was Flint's answer. A dry smile touched one corner of Cullen's mouth before disappearing. There were mornings when the dog was the only living creature capable of making Cullen laugh before coffee. He locked the cabin and followed. Their walks had begun as an excuse to inspect the property boundaries. By the 4th morning, Cullen had stopped pretending. Flint simply liked the woods, and Cullen discovered he disliked them less when he was not alone. They followed an old logging trail north of the cabin. Sunlight filtered through birches and striped the path with gold. Ferns spread beneath cedar branches. Somewhere downhill, water moved over stone with a steady whisper, and through openings in the trees came sudden glimpses of Lake Superior, brilliant and cold beneath the sky. Flint ranged several yards ahead but never beyond Cullen's control. He investigated scents without losing awareness of his handler. Every few minutes one ear turned backward to catch the sound of Cullen's boots. It was the habit of a dog who had spent too many years working beside humans to forget that half his environment walked on 2 legs. Cullen understood the language of those ears. He understood the changes in Flint's gait, the tightening of his shoulders, the way his tail lowered when a scent became important. Trusting Flint had never been Cullen's problem. Trusting himself was another matter. His phone vibrated once inside his field jacket. He already knew what he would see before pulling it out. No new call, no new message. Just the notification he had failed to dismiss for nearly 3 weeks. Voicemail, Marcus Delaney. Cullen stared at the name. Marcus Mac Delaney had once been built much like Cullen, broad-shouldered, stubborn, and difficult to impress. He had been 44 the last time Cullen had seen a recent photograph of him, dark hair beginning to gray, beard trimmed short, an old scar near his left temple and one leg that no longer moved quite the way it once had. Mac had survived. That fact should have made everything easier. It had not. Years earlier, Mac had told Cullen that something about their withdrawal route felt wrong. Intelligence said otherwise. The UAV feed said otherwise. Cullen had waited for confirmation. Minutes later, an explosion tore through part of the route and left Mac with injuries he would carry permanently. No inquiry had blamed Cullen. Mac had never blamed Cullen. Cullen had accomplished enough of that for everyone. He returned the phone to his pocket without playing the message. Ahead, Flint stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The change was so abrupt that Cullen noticed immediately. The German Shepherd stood in the center of the logging trail with one front paw slightly lifted, his ears angled left. Cullen followed his gaze. Cedar, birch, a wall of fern and young spruce. Nothing moved. What is it? Flint inhaled. His nostrils worked rapidly. Then he took 3 steps forward, stopped again, and looked left. Cullen checked the wind. A faint breeze came off the lake from the northwest, moving diagonally across the trail. Whatever had Flint's attention was not directly upwind. Cullen crouched and studied the ground. Deer tracks, squirrel disturbance. A faint impression from an old boot sole, probably a hiker from days earlier. Nothing that explained the dog's interest. Forward, Flint obeyed. For 4 steps. Then he turned his head back toward the same section of forest. Cullen straightened slowly. The old irritation rose before he could stop it. Not at Flint, but at uncertainty itself. He had once lived in a world where uncertainty got people killed. Maps, intel, radio reports, drone footage, angles, timelines. Everything had to become measurable before it could become actionable. Flint stared at him. Cullen exhaled. All right. The dog immediately left the trail. Cullen muttered, "Good discussion." Flint's tail moved once. They descended through ferns and low cedar branches. The slope became steeper, forcing Cullen to place each boot carefully among exposed roots. Flint moved easily, muscles shifting beneath his coat, occasionally stopping to sample the air. There was no urgency in him. That interested Cullen more than excitement would have. Flint was not chasing wildlife. He was following something. Halfway down the slope, Flint suddenly froze beside a cluster of young birches. His body lowered, not fear, attention. Cullen stopped behind him. For several seconds, the forest seemed perfectly ordinary. Then Flint slowly turned his head toward Cullen and gave him a look Cullen remembered from places far removed from Minnesota forests. A silent check-in, the kind the dog used when something existed beyond the limits of human senses. Cullen felt a faint tightening beneath his ribs. Years ago, he would have demanded a clearer sign. Now he simply whispered, "Show me." Flint moved. They passed through the birches, and the forest opened around something impossible. At first, Cullen saw only rust. A flat wall of reddish-brown steel rose between cedar trunks, taller than the cabin and extending so far in both directions that his mind tried to classify it as a building. Then he noticed riveted seams, a curved hull, a row of corroded openings far above his head. He stepped farther downhill. The scale revealed itself. It was a ship, a freighter, a massive one. Its bow still pointed toward Lake Superior, but the middle of the vessel had settled into the shallow stone and gravel shoreline so completely that decades of forest had grown around it. Birch trunks stood inches from the hull. Moss swallowed the lower steps of an exterior ladder. Vines disappeared through broken bridge windows high above. The ship looked less abandoned than reclaimed, as if the forest had been slowly constructing itself around a steel skeleton. Faded letters stretched across the hull. Cedar Crown Cullen stood beneath them in silence. He remembered the man at the general store mentioning it 2 days earlier. The shopkeeper had called it the forest ship, and laughed when Cullen admitted he had never heard of it. Everyone in Copperwake knew Cedar Crown. It had grounded in 1987 during what official records described as a navigation accident in severe weather. The shipping company collapsed not long afterward. Salvage costs, liability disputes, land ownership, and environmental assessments tangled together for years until removing the vessel became more expensive than leaving it where it was. Now Ironcrest Reclamation held the contract to dismantle what remained. There was nothing mysterious about the ship's existence. What bothered Cullen was Flint. The German Shepherd was not staring at the enormous hull. He was moving along it. Cullen followed. They reached a section where cedar branches crowded an old service stairway. Flint pushed his nose through the lower branches and sniffed. Cullen looked down. Mud, fresh mud. Not merely damp soil preserved beneath shade. Someone had stepped here recently enough for the tread edges to remain crisp. He moved one branch aside. The twig snapped easily because it had already been partially broken. Fresh wood showed pale beneath the bark. Someone's been here. Flint glanced back as if that conclusion had taken Cullen an unreasonable amount of time. The stairway ended at a steel access door. Its original lock had corroded nearly beyond recognition, but a newer hasp had been bolted beside it. Cullen touched the metal. Recent scratches exposed bright steel beneath the oxidized surface. Then he noticed a black electrical cable running from beneath the door, disappearing along the exterior and into undergrowth. That did not belong to 1987. Cullen studied the ship again. Ironcrest had salvage rights. A contractor using power equipment aboard an old vessel would not be remarkable. But contractors normally did not hide their access behind cedar branches. Flint sniffed the threshold. His body tightened. Cullen pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. He considered returning to the trail, driving into Copperwake and calling the sheriff. That was the sensible decision. It was also a 20 to 30-minute delay if someone inside needed help. Cullen looked at Flint. Quick check. The dog stood ready. We find workers, we leave. Flint blinked. Glad you agree. The door had not been fully latched. Cullen opened it. The smell came first. Cold steel, stagnant water, old oil, rotting fabric. The interior was dim, but daylight entered through broken windows and holes in the superstructure. Dust floated in pale beams. Cullen waited for his eyes to adjust. The passageway ahead had once been painted cream. Rust now spread across it like dried blood. Metal lockers leaned crooked against one wall. A cracked enamel mug lay on the floor beside a coil of ancient rope, but threaded through all that age were unmistakably modern objects. A yellow extension cord, fresh boot impressions in dust, a red plastic fuel can. Cullen's attention sharpened. Flint entered slowly. The dog's paws made soft clicks against steel. They moved deeper. Cullen did not touch anything he did not need to touch. Old habits returned without invitation. He registered exits, ceiling integrity, visibility, sound. He hated how natural it still felt. A modern cable ran down the corridor and disappeared through a bulkhead. Flint sniffed the floor. Another set of prints, possibly 2 people, maybe 3. The interior creaked around them. A ship was never truly silent, even one stranded for almost 40 years. Steel expanded beneath sunlight. Water moved beneath the grounded hull. Wind traveled through openings and turned distant pieces of metal into slow, irregular chimes. Cullen reminded himself of that when he heard the first dull knock. He stopped. Flint stopped too. Wind? The dog looked toward a hatch at the far end of the passageway. Cullen approached. The hatch was heavier than the others and fitted into the deck, leading downward. A newer padlock secured it. A small metal plate remained screwed beside the opening. Lower service deck. Flint stepped past Cullen. He lowered his head until one ear nearly touched the steel floor. Cullen watched him. The dog became absolutely still. Then Flint lifted one paw. Scratch, scratch, scratch. 3 deliberate strokes against metal. Cullen frowned. Flint. The dog did not move. For a moment there was only the whisper of wind through the ship. Then knock, a pause, knock, another pause, knock from below. Cullen's breathing changed. Not much, just enough. Flint scratched again, 3 times. The reply came faster now. 3 faint metallic impacts. Someone was down there. Cullen crouched beside the hatch. Hey, no answer. He struck the steel with the heel of his hand. Can you hear me? A muffled noise came from below. Human. Cullen rose and examined the lock. New, industrial, locked from the outside. That changed everything. He reached into his pocket for the compact multi-tool he carried around the cabin. Flint abruptly moved against him. The dog caught the back of Cullen's jacket between his teeth and pulled. Flint? Cullen stepped sideways. A violent metallic crack sounded above him. A sheet of corroded ceiling plating broke loose and slammed onto the deck exactly where he had been standing. Dust exploded through the corridor. Cullen froze. For half a second, Cedar Crown vanished. Minnesota vanished. He saw Mac turning his head years earlier. Something's wrong. Saw data glowing on a screen. Saw his own decision to wait. Saw fire. He heard the old lesson he had carved into himself afterward. Never move until you know. Then he looked at Flint. The German shepherd had no idea what memory had just opened inside his handler. Flint simply stood beside the fallen steel, breathing evenly, waiting. Cullen swallowed. You knew enough. His voice came out quieter than he intended. He knelt at the padlock. This time he did not wait. It took several minutes of leverage and brute force to break the weakened fitting. When the lock finally tore loose, Cullen pulled the hatch upward. Cold air rose from below. A narrow steel stairway descended into darkness. Stay close. Flint followed. Cullen switched on his flashlight. The beam swept over pipes, rusted valves, patches of standing water. Then it found a hand. A woman sat against the bulkhead at the bottom of the stairs. She raised one arm to shield her eyes. Easy, Cullen said. I'm not with whoever put you here. The woman lowered her arm slowly. She looked somewhere in her mid-30s, perhaps 36. Slender but with the wiry strength of someone accustomed to fieldwork rather than gyms. Her light skin had taken on a grayish pallor beneath its natural outdoor tan, and freckles showed across her nose and cheekbones. Chestnut brown hair, normally worn to the shoulders, had partly escaped a low tie and clung damply to her face. Her green hazel eyes were exhausted but sharply alert. She wore a mustard brown waterproof outdoor jacket over a light gray Henley, charcoal hiking pants, and dark brown hiking boots. A small sampling bag remained strapped across her body. One ankle was swollen badly. There was dried blood near her temple. Flint approached but stopped several feet away. The woman stared at him. Is he friendly? Cullen glanced at Flint. More than me. For the first time, something almost like relief crossed her face. My name's Nora Keene. Her voice was hoarse. Hydrologist. County Watershed Program. Cullen, Vale. He handed her his water bottle. She took it with both hands, drank a little, stopped, then drank again. How long? Since yesterday afternoon. Maybe 16 hours. Cullen crouched beside her injured ankle without touching it. What happened? Nora inhaled slowly. I was sampling downstream. We've had irregular readings. Small enough that nobody panicked, but wrong enough that I kept checking. Her eyes moved toward the darkness behind them. I found an old drain line, followed it here. You entered the ship alone? A trace of defensiveness returned. I photographed the exterior first. Then I saw newer piping. I came inside far enough to document it. Cullen said nothing. Nora understood the criticism anyway. Yes, I know. What happened next? I heard someone, a man. I never got a good look at his face. He took my camera, grabbed my arm. I ran. She looked at her ankle. Didn't run very well. You were locked in? He said I'd be out in an hour. Cullen's expression hardened. He said that? He sounded scared. Angry, but mostly scared. He shoved me down here and locked the hatch. Nora pointed into the passage behind her. There's supposed to be another service exit. It collapsed years ago. She looked at Cullen. I don't think he knew. That distinction mattered. It did not make the act harmless, but it changed the shape of it. Cullen stood. We'll go out the way we came. He helped Nora to her feet. She winced but did not complain. Flint turned toward the stairs, then stopped. Cullen noticed immediately. The dog placed one paw on the first step, withdrew it, his ears angled upward. Nora looked between them. What? Cullen did not answer. He listened. A tiny ping came from the stair assembly. Then another, metal under stress. Flint backed away. Cullen moved Nora with him. 3 seconds later, a corroded joint near the upper railing snapped. The railing twisted sideways. 2 steps tore loose and crashed down through the lower section of the stairwell. Nora stared at the wreckage, then at Flint. Does he do that often? Cullen looked at the dog. More often than I'm comfortable admitting. There would be no returning the way they came. Cullen swept his flashlight toward the service corridor behind Nora. The darkness seemed deeper now. Can you walk? With help. You've got it. They moved slowly into the lower deck. Nora leaned lightly against Cullen when the pain became too strong. Flint went ahead, stopping every few yards to check air movement and scent. The ship changed around them. Less daylight. More pipes. More standing water. The faint smell of fuel somewhere ahead. Cullen felt the old part of his mind waking completely now, cataloging each detail without permission. He disliked that part of himself. He also knew they needed it. After several minutes, Flint stopped. His ears went up. Cullen raised one fist. Nora froze beside him. A sound came from above. Not metal shifting, not wind. A footstep, slow, measured. Someone was walking on the deck above them. Cullen switched off his flashlight. Darkness swallowed all three. Another footstep crossed overhead, then another. Flint did not growl. He simply stared upward. The footsteps stopped, directly above them. Cullen did not like corridors that offered only one way forward. He liked them even less when the person beside him could barely put weight on one foot. The lower service passage narrowed as it curved toward the lakeside section of Cedar Crown. Old pipes crowded the ceiling. Rust hung from them in thin red flakes, and the air tasted faintly metallic. Nora Keene moved with one hand against the bulkhead, and the other occasionally gripping Cullen's forearm when her injured ankle failed beneath her. Flint remained several yards ahead. The 7-year-old German shepherd no longer moved with the curiosity he had shown in the forest. His black and tan body had become compact and deliberate, head level with his shoulders, dark amber eyes searching every doorway. The coyote brown working harness shifted quietly against his coat as he sampled air flowing through the ship. Cullen trusted that posture. It meant Flint was working, not frightened, not excited, working. They reached a junction where daylight seeped through a cracked ventilation grill. Nora leaned against the wall and caught her breath. You always bring him when you trespass. Cullen glanced at her. I prefer unplanned structural inspection. Despite the pain, Nora gave a short laugh. It was the first sound she had made that did not carry exhaustion. Cullen pointed toward a pipe running shoulder-high along the wall. That new? Nora followed his gaze. The pipe was white PVC, far cleaner than anything around it. Stainless clamps attached it to steel brackets that looked decades older. A black power cable ran beside it. Yes. She straightened slightly. Very. They followed it. The passage opened into what had once been a maintenance compartment. An old workbench remained bolted to one wall, its drawers rusted shut. Beside it stood equipment that could not have been more than a few years old. A portable generator, 2 electric transfer pumps, a coil of reinforced hose, plastic chemical-resistant fittings, 3 red fuel cans, a temporary breaker panel. Cullen crouched near the generator without touching it. Dust covered the old deck, everywhere except beneath the machine. It had been moved recently. Nora examined the hoses. Industrial dewatering setup. Legal? Could be. Her answer came quickly enough to surprise him. Cullen looked up. I thought you were here because you believed somebody was dumping something. I'm here because the water numbers are strange. That's not the same thing. No. She rubbed dirt from one hose with the edge of her sleeve. Ironcrest has permits to pump accumulated water from parts of this vessel. Any salvage operation on a grounded ship this old would need it. They can't cut compartments open while they're full of water. Cullen stood. So this could all belong here. Every single piece. Nora looked toward the pipe disappearing through the bulkhead and still be connected to something that doesn't. That was the part Cullen disliked most. A clean answer would have been easier. Criminals leaving illegal pumps in an abandoned ship. Simple. Instead they had legitimate equipment, a legitimate salvage company, a woman who had been illegally confined, and no clear line connecting one fact to the others. Flint suddenly moved. His head snapped toward a grated stairwell rising to the next deck. Cullen saw movement a second later. A shadow crossed the strip of daylight above. Human, stay here. He was already moving. Flint followed. Cullen took the stairs 2 at a time until the metal beneath his boots became too soft to trust. He slowed, reached the upper landing, and caught sight of the back of someone slipping through a doorway. Dark work jacket. Heavy boots. Male, probably. Stop. The figure disappeared. Cullen pushed through the doorway into a broader passage open in places to the lake. Sunlight flashed through broken windows. Flint accelerated, nose low. Cullen followed the dog instead of chasing what he thought he had seen. That distinction mattered. Flint cut right through an old crew galley, past overturned tables, then stopped at a service opening where part of the exterior wall had been removed. Cold lake air rushed inside. Below, a narrow metal ladder descended to a strip of rocks at the waterline. The man was gone. Flint sniffed the ladder, then the railing, then a jagged edge of torn sheet metal. Something hung there. A work glove. Brown leather. Dirty. One seam ripped open. Cullen did not pick it up. He took a photograph with his phone and memorized the location. Nora reached them several minutes later, moving painfully but refusing to wait alone. Anything? Someone went out this way. He pointed at the glove. Her face tightened. You think it's the man who took my camera? I think it's a glove. Nora studied him. That sounded almost philosophical. It's been a strange morning. They found another route down through an exterior service platform. Cullen went first, then helped Nora descend, while Flint navigated the steps without difficulty. By the time they reached the ground, the sunlight felt almost unnatural. The forest beyond Cedar Crown was bright and alive. Wind moved through yellowing birches. Gulls wheeled over the water. The enormous rusted hull stood behind them like a dark country they had temporarily escaped. Cullen called the Copperwake Sheriff's office as soon as his phone found signal. Deputies arrived first. Sheriff Dana Kittredge came 10 minutes later. At 49, Dana had the solid, unhurried presence of someone who had long ago stopped mistaking volume for authority. She stood about 5'8" with a sturdy build, square face, pale blue eyes, and ash-brown hair streaked with gray and tied low behind her neck. Fine lines bracketed her eyes from years spent squinting into northern sun and winter wind. Her tan sheriff's uniform was neat without looking ceremonial, worn beneath a dark brown duty jacket with a small metal badge at the chest. Dana listened more than she spoke. That alone made Cullen trust her slightly. She first sent Nora with a deputy to be medically examined, then photographed the access points and had the glove bagged and marked. When Cullen finished explaining what they had seen inside, Dana looked at Cedar Crown for several seconds. You understand Ironcrest has authorized access to most of that ship. I do. Modern pumps aren't evidence of wrongdoing. I know. You also entered private salvage property. Cullen nodded. I did. Dana studied him. You always this agreeable when somebody tells you you may have broken a law? Only before lunch. One corner of her mouth twitched, almost. Then her expression hardened again. Nora missed a scheduled field check-in yesterday. Her supervisor called us at 7:30. We searched the access roads until after midnight. Cullen glanced toward the vehicle where Nora sat with ice wrapped around her ankle. So you already had a missing person? We did. Dana looked back at the ship. Now I've got a woman telling me someone took her camera and locked her below deck. She paused. That interests me a lot more than a pump. Nora refused transport to a hospital after the local clinic confirmed the ankle was badly sprained rather than broken. By afternoon, she sat in the Copperwake sheriff's office with the injured leg elevated on another chair and a paper cup of coffee cooling between her hands. Cullen sat opposite. Flint lay beside him. Dana stood near a whiteboard where Nora had spread out a laminated watershed map. The office smelled faintly of copier toner, old wood, and somebody's burnt lunch. Nora tapped a cluster of blue marks south of Cedar Crown. I didn't start with the ship. Dana folded her arms. Start wherever you did. For about 6 weeks, this monitoring point has shown intermittent increases in dissolved metals and processing salts. Dangerous, not at the levels we recorded. Dana raised an eyebrow. Then why were you chasing pipes through the forest? Because natural systems don't usually schedule themselves around work shifts. That got Cullen's attention. Nora continued. The readings rise after certain periods when machinery has been running near the Cedar Crown site. Not every time, and never enough to violate a limit by themselves. So Ironcrest could say coincidence, Dana said. They could, and scientifically, I'd say correlation is not causation. Cullen looked at her. You hate that sentence. I hate when people use it to stop asking questions. Then Nora traced a line down the map. I took upstream and downstream samples. Then I found an old drainage channel beneath brush near the south side of the property. It carried intermittent flow toward the wetland. She pointed toward Cedar Crown. I followed it backward. Dana nodded slowly. And that's when you entered the ship? Yes, without telling anybody. Nora looked into her coffee. That part was stupid. Cullen said, good, saves us time. She looked at him. Are you always this supportive? Only before dinner? Flint lifted his head at the word. Dana actually smiled this time. Then the room settled again. The humor had done what Cullen's humor often did. Opened a small window before somebody closed it. Dana gathered the evidence bags. I'm contacting Ironcrest. Nora's expression tightened. If the man who locked me in works for them, we don't know that. Dana's tone was firm but not dismissive. And neither do you. That was important. Cullen knew how quickly suspicion could become certainty once a mind wanted it badly enough. He had spent years learning that lesson the expensive way. Mitchell Rusk arrived at the sheriff's office before sunset. He was 57 and built like a man who had once spent every day doing physical work, but now spent more of it supervising others. At roughly 6 feet, he had a broad, heavy frame, a wide face, strong jaw, and a nose slightly larger than proportion demanded. His skin carried the permanent reddish tan of someone raised outdoors. Brown-gray hair was combed back neatly, silver prominent at both temples. He was clean-shaven except for a faint shadow along the chin. He wore a dark brown canvas work jacket over a blue-gray chambray shirt, charcoal work pants, brown industrial boots, and a plain steel watch. Nothing about him looked theatrical. That made him harder to read. Rusk placed a folder on Dana's desk. Salvage permit, dewatering authorization, environmental handling contract. Dana flipped through the papers. You brought these fast. I knew what you were going to ask. His voice was calm. No defensiveness, no outrage. He looked at Nora. I heard what happened. I'm sorry. Nora watched him carefully. Do you know who locked me down there? No. The answer was immediate. Rusk did not look away. If it was one of mine, I want to know. Cullen studied him. Rusk noticed. Your Vale. That's what people keep telling me. I heard you found her. Flint did most of the useful work. Rusk glanced at the German shepherd. Flint remained lying down, but his eyes tracked the man. Rusk nodded once. My father worked salvage after Cedar Crown grounded. That ship has fed Copperwake almost as long as it's haunted it. Nora frowned. Fed it? Ironcrest employs 53 people directly, more through trucking and subcontractors. Rusk leaned one hand on Dana's desk. Removing Cedar Crown safely is a 3-year job, maybe longer. It's dangerous, expensive, and overdue. He pushed the environmental contract toward Nora. Yes, we pump water from compartments. Where does it go, she asked. Settling tanks first, then treatment, then approved discharge. Do you pump from lower service spaces? Some. Hold 4. A tiny pause. Not dramatic, just enough for Cullen to notice. Not directly, Nora noticed too. What does that mean? It means the ship has interconnected drainage water moves. Rusk's gaze remained steady. If you're suggesting we're secretly dumping contaminated water into Copperwake, you're wrong. Nora said, I didn't say that. No. Rusk looked at her injured ankle. But you were thinking it. Flint rose. No growl, no bark. He walked toward Mitchell Rusk, stopped several feet away and sniffed the air. Every person in the room went quiet. Rusk looked down at the dog. Cullen's instincts tightened. Then Flint turned away from Rusk completely. He crossed the office, moved toward the open doorway, and fixed his attention on the gravel parking lot outside. A man had just stepped from an Ironcrest utility truck. Flint stared at him. For one sharp second, Cullen felt certainty rush in before evidence had arrived. The old dangerous feeling. There, that's him. And because the thought came so fast, Cullen almost trusted it. The man entering the office was about 39, 5'10", with the compact strength of a maintenance worker rather than an athlete. He had a slightly round face, unevenly suntanned skin, hazel eyes mixing brown and green, and short light brown hair that looked as though he had run his fingers through it too many times that day. Short stubble darkened his jaw. He wore a forest green work shirt beneath a light brown canvas vest, tan utility pants, and brown work boots. A flashlight and pen sat clipped into one chest pocket. Worn gloves protruded from the back of his trousers. His name was Gavin Sloan, and the moment he saw Nora, every bit of color seemed to leave his face. Cullen stood. Gavin stopped. Flint took one step toward him. There, Cullen said quietly. Dana turned her head. There what? Cullen looked at Flint, then at Gavin. The dog has something, Gavin swallowed. I didn't touch her. Nobody had accused him yet. That made the room colder. Nora straightened. You know who I am? Gavin stared at her. I heard. Cullen stepped closer. Flint sniffed Gavin's boots and trousers, then turned toward the parking lot again. Gavin's breathing quickened. Cullen felt the conclusion assembling itself. The glove, the Ironcrest truck, Gavin's reaction, Flint. Dana's voice cut through it. Vale. Cullen looked at her. What exactly did your dog indicate? He recognized scent. Whose? Cullen hesitated. Dana pointed toward the evidence bag containing the leather glove. That glove is Ironcrest issued. Rusk just confirmed every salvage worker gets the same kind. Cullen glanced at Flint. The dog was now sniffing the side of the utility truck where several workers had probably leaned, loaded equipment and handled tools. Not Gavin. The environment. The workplace place. Cullen felt something inside him shift unpleasantly. He had done it again. Not ignored a signal this time. Misread one. He had taken Flint's information and turned it into the answer he wanted. Gavin looked at him with frightened anger. I didn't lock her anywhere. Cullen held his gaze, then stepped back. All right. Gavin blinked. That's it? That's what I know right now. Dana said nothing, but Cullen could feel her watching him. Flint returned to his side. Cullen rested one hand briefly against the dog's neck. You didn't say it was him. Flint looked up. Of course he had not. Over the next 2 days, the investigation became less dramatic and more troubling. Nora returned to her data. Dana interviewed Ironcrest workers. Rusk provided logs. On paper, much of the operation looked normal. That was the problem. Normal things could hide inside other normal things very effectively. Nora found the first meaningful inconsistency late the second afternoon. She had converted Ironcrest's pumping logs into estimated volume and compared them with equipment capacity. Cullen sat with her in a small meeting room while Flint slept beneath the table. Nora slid a page toward him. The permit says they're pumping from 3 compartments. Cullen studied numbers that meant very little to him. And the listed pumps shouldn't be moving this much water. How much more depends on operating hours. 30%. Maybe 40. Bad bookkeeping? Possible. Broken meter? Possible. He looked at her. You're enjoying this. Immensely. She drew a line under one column. But if the equipment hours are accurate, there's another source feeding the system. Another compartment or another pump. Cullen leaned back. So we still don't have proof. No. Nora smiled without humor. We have something worse. What? A reason to keep looking. That evening, Cullen returned to his uncle's cabin. For nearly an hour, he repaired a cabinet hinge that did not need repairing. His phone lay on the table. Mac's voicemail remained unopened. Flint lay near the porch door, occasionally lifting his head at sounds outside. Cullen thought about Gavin, about how quickly he had wanted the man to be guilty. He had spent years believing his greatest failure had been hesitation. Now he wondered whether certainty could be just as dangerous. The answer bothered him, because both errors came from the same place, fear of being wrong. At 8:17 that night, Sheriff Dana Kittredge was alone in her office when someone knocked on the back entrance. She expected a deputy. Instead, she found Gavin Sloane standing under the security light. He looked as if he had spent the entire walk there deciding whether to turn around. "Sheriff." Dana opened the door. "What happened?" "Nothing." "That's usually when people show up after dark." Gavin glanced toward the parking lot. "Can we talk where nobody sees me?" Dana led him inside. He refused coffee, refused to sit. He kept rubbing one thumb against the side of his index finger, a repetitive motion she recognized as the kind people made when guilt needed somewhere physical to go. Finally, Gavin reached inside his canvas vest. Dana's hand moved instinctively toward her duty belt. Gavin froze. Paper, slowly. He withdrew a folded photocopy, old, grainy, a partial engineering diagram of Cedar Crown. Dana opened it on the desk. Someone had drawn a pencil line across the plan. It began near Hold 4, ran through a lower drainage route, and ended at a settling pond on Ironcrest property. Dana looked up. "Where did you get this?" Gavin stared at the map rather than her. "You're looking at the wrong pump." Dana said nothing. Silence worked. People often filled it. Gavin did. "The permitted pumps aren't the ones you should be counting." "Who drew this line?" "I can't tell you." "Can't or won't?" His jaw tightened. "Both." Dana pointed to Hold 4. "What's in there? I don't know." That answer sounded honest. Then Gavin added something that did not. "Not exactly." Dana's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Gavin finally looked at her. Fear had replaced indecision. Real fear. "Just don't let anybody open Hold 4 until you know what it used to carry." He backed toward the door. Dana stopped him with a question. "Gavin," he turned, "why are you telling me this now?" For several seconds he seemed unable to answer. Then he looked down at his grease-stained hands. "Because I helped build the line," and left the map on her desk. He imagined Merritt on the bridge, knowing that everybody studying the wreck afterward might call it failure. Cullen's thumb rested against the edge of the paper. For years he had remembered only one kind of wrong decision, the kind that hurt someone. He had rarely allowed himself to consider the other kind. The decision that looked wrong from outside because nobody could see what it prevented. F watched him. "You recognize that look?" Cullen's eyes lifted. "What look?" "The one men get when they're wondering whether somebody from 40 years ago made the same mistake they did." Cullen said nothing. F gave him a tired smile. "Old men don't get wise. We just get nosy." The line broke something tense in the room. Nora exhaled. Even Cullen almost smiled. Then F's face changed again. "There's more." After the grounding, F had worked shoreline support during cleanup. Most cargo was removed. Damaged material was transferred. Hold 4 was flushed. At least that was the official version. One night, F said, "I saw 3 containment drums being lowered into the lower section, not brought out." Nora frowned. "You're sure?" "I was 30-something, not 90. 81, Cullen said. F pointed at him. "Keep talking and I'll become 90. Then his humor disappeared. "I asked a supervisor. He told me the drums were empty. Said they were being staged for disposal." "Did you see them removed later?" "No." "Did you report it?" F looked toward the window. His pale eyes reflected the lake. "I had a wife. 2 daughters. Mill work was seasonal. Port money kept food in the house." He swallowed. "I told myself men smarter than me were handling it." Cullen knew that sentence. Not the exact words. The architecture. Everyone had a version of it. F continued. "Then the company went under. Contractors arrived. Inspectors came and left. Somebody declared the ship safe enough to abandon." His hand closed around the chair arm. "I kept expecting someone to ask me." "No one did," Nora said. "No." F looked at her. "And after a while, I got grateful they didn't." The confession seemed to age him more than 81 years ever had. Cullen did not offer forgiveness. That was not his to give. He only asked, "Why tell us now?" F's gaze moved toward Flint. "Because somebody got locked inside that ship." Then toward Nora's bandaged ankle. "And because apparently 40 years is long enough to be a coward." While Cullen stayed with F, Nora and Dana returned to the archived environmental records. The inconsistency appeared in a box containing preliminary sampling sheets. The first set carried the name North Range Environmental Services. The final report listed North Range Industrial Compliance, LLC. Related companies, perhaps, but not identical. More troubling were the numbers. Early samples from water around Hold 4 contained significantly higher concentrations than the values cited in the final cleanup report. Not catastrophic, not proof of a hidden disaster, but high enough that Nora leaned closer to the page. "These should be referenced the final submission." Dana scanned the report. They aren't. Several sample IDs were missing entirely. Other values appeared to have been replaced by later measurements without explanation. Dana looked at Nora. "Fraud? Maybe. Bad record keeping? Also maybe. You scientists are exhausting. We practice." Dana photographed every page. For the first time, The old story and the present investigation were beginning to touch. By late afternoon, Cullen drove to the Ironcrest yard with Flint beside him. He wanted Gavin, not to accuse him, to ask him why a line connected Hold 4 to the settling pond now, almost 40 years after the compartment had supposedly been made safe. The Ironcrest yard was quieter than usual. A row of excavators sat beneath the gray sky. Metal containers stood near the fence. Cullen found Gavin's workstation empty. A half-disassembled pump rested on the bench. His jacket was gone. His personal tool bag was gone. His time card showed he had clocked in that morning. Not out. Cullen noticed a hose coupling near the edge of the bench. Dark wet mud clung inside its threads. He recognized the gray-brown silt from the settling pond area behind the yard. Beside it lay a maintenance slip. At the bottom was a signature. Cole Varden. Site foreman Cullen asked the nearest supervisor where Varden was. The man pointed toward an employee board mounted near the office. Cole Varden's photograph showed a 46-year-old man around 6'2", lean and hard from years of salvage work rather than gym training. His narrow face ended in a sharply defined jaw. A nose that had once been broken sat slightly crooked beneath dark brown eyes. Black hair streaked with gray was cut very short, and dark stubble covered his cheeks. A small scar crossed his right eyebrow. According to the supervisor, Varden was quiet, exacting, and notoriously confident in his own judgment. He had spent years in hazardous industrial salvage and had developed a reputation for believing every dangerous job eventually required someone willing to ignore hesitation. Cullen disliked that philosophy immediately. Dana called 10 minutes later. Traffic camera review had placed Varden's truck on the service road leading towards Cedar Crown during the window in which Nora disappeared. Not proof, but no longer coincidence. Then Dana added another fact. Varden had not returned home the previous night. His phone was off. Ironcrest could not locate him. Cullen looked toward the equipment shed. Gavin, also not answering. A cold knot formed beneath Cullen's ribs. Dana continued. And we've got one more problem. What? One of Ironcrest's service boats is missing from its berth. Cullen looked through the trees toward Lake Superior. Somewhere beyond them, Cedar Crown waited in its shallow bay. Gavin was gone. Cole Varden was gone. And now someone had taken a boat. By 9 the next morning, Cedar Crown had become more complicated on paper than it had ever looked in the forest. Sheriff Dana Kittredge stood over a conference table covered in maps, photocopied permits, pump logs, and old county records while rain tapped lightly against the office windows. The bright weather that had greeted Cullen when he first arrived in Copperwake had given way to a thin northern overcast, but the lake beyond town still showed bands of blue between the trees. Gavin Sloan had not answered Dana's first call, or her second. That did not make him a fugitive. It made him a frightened employee who had admitted just enough to put himself in danger with his own company. Cullen understood that kind of fear better than he wanted to. People often imagined moral decisions arriving with trumpets and clear labels. In Cullen's experience, they usually appeared much smaller. A report somebody decided not to file. A question left unasked. A 10-second delay because certainty had not yet arrived. Flint lay beneath the table near Cullen's boots, alert despite appearing relaxed. The German shepherd's dark amber eyes tracked every person who crossed the room. His black and tan coat was dry now. The coyote brown working harness brushed clean of yesterday's dust. Nora sat with one ankle still wrapped and elevated on a chair while she read an old environmental summary. Dana tapped the Cedar Crown diagram with one finger. Gavin's map isn't enough for a warrant on Hold 4. Nora nodded. No chain of custody, no source, and Rusk says that drawing could be 20 years out of date. Cullen looked toward Mitchell Russick, who had come in voluntarily after Dana requested clarification. Rusk stood beside the window, broad shoulders filling his dark brown canvas jacket. Because it probably is, he said. Dana looked at him. Probably? Rusk exhaled through his nose. Hold 4 was isolated after the grounding. The ship has been modified by 3 different salvage contractors since then. Drain lines got capped, pumps were moved, temporary bypasses were installed. Nora held up the photocopy. Was there ever a line from Hold 4 to your settling pond? Rusk hesitated. Not one that should be active now. That wasn't my question. No. His voice remained steady. Yes, there was an old route through the lower drainage manifold. Dana's eyes narrowed. You could mention that yesterday. I didn't know that was the route Gavin was pointing to. Cullen watched Rusk's face. The man was either telling the truth or had spent many years learning how to wear truth convincingly. Both possibilities bothered him. Rusk placed both palms against the table. Look, Hold 4 has been considered closed for decades. Every report I inherited said it was cleaned, isolated, and safe. Considered by whom? Nora asked. Environmental contractors. State inspectors. The owners before us. Names, Rusk gave them. Dana wrote them down. Then Rusk looked at Cullen. If you're waiting for me to slip and admit there's a secret chemical vault inside that ship, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm not waiting for anything. Rusk smiled without warmth. You look like a man who always waits. The words landed more accurately than Rusk could have known. Cullen did not react. Flint's head lifted briefly, then settled again. Nora found the first piece of historical context before lunch. The county archive had digitized only part of the Cedar Crown file. The rest remained in paper storage at a municipal annex 2 blocks away, where decades of documents lived in beige boxes under fluorescent lights. The official 1987 cargo manifest listed mining equipment, replacement machine parts, and several regulated industrial chemicals used in mineral processing. That by itself was not suspicious. What caught Nora's attention was the amount. These quantities aren't enormous, she said. Dana stood beside her while Cullen leaned against a file cabinet. Enough to be dangerous. In the wrong concentration, yes. But legal transport doesn't mean scandal. Nora turned another page. After the grounding, cleanup crews removed most of the chemical cargo. This report says Hold 4 was flushed, inspected, and declared safe. Cullen studied the signature block. So on paper, this is over. On paper, Nora said. There were photographs attached. Grainy images showed Cedar Crown soon after the grounding, before trees had grown around it. The hull sat hard against a shallow bank beneath a gray sky. Tugboats floated off the stern. Men in hard hats stood on the deck. One image had a caption, Controlled Cargo Removal. October 1987. Cullen stared at the phrase, controlled, not emergency, not accident. Something about the language felt too careful. Nora continued through the files. No mass casualty event, no missing tanker, no secret government operation, nothing like that. Dana gave Cullen a sidelong look. Disappointed? Deeply. Nora almost smiled. Then she found another name, Ephraim Boone. He appeared twice in a list of local support workers assigned to the shoreline response. Dana recognized it immediately. F. You know him? Cullen asked. Everybody knows F. That answer carried the peculiar weight of small towns. Dana closed the file. He lives northeast of town. Worked the port, then maintenance at the mill. Retired years ago. Would he talk? Dana considered. Depends what you ask. Cullen looked at Flint. Sounds promising. Ephraim Boone's house stood above the lake at the end of a narrow gravel road, crowded by white birch and spruce. It was not the kind of place built for beauty, yet time had made it beautiful anyway. Gray cedar siding, a rusted weather vane, wood stacked with obsessive neatness under an overhang. From the porch, Lake Superior opened beyond the trees, blue-gray beneath the afternoon sky. F answered Cullen's knock after a long delay. At 81, he still carried remnants of the strength that had once hauled chain, cable, and machinery around the docks. He stood about 5'9" now, though age had curved his shoulders forward and reduced him from whatever height he had once claimed. His body had gone lean beneath a faded navy chore coat and a brown and cream flannel shirt. Brown work trousers disappeared into old leather boots. His face was long and deeply lined, with prominent cheekbones and pale blue eyes that seemed tired until they focused on something, at which point they became surprisingly sharp. Thin white hair had been brushed backward without much concern for neatness. A short silver-white beard covered his chin and jaw. He looked first at Cullen, then at Flint. The sheriff send you? No. Then you're selling something? No. F frowned. That's worse. Cullen liked him immediately. I'm Cullen Vale. I know who you are. That surprised him. F looked toward the road. Copperwake has 4 hobbies. Fishing, complaining about winter, complaining when winter leaves, and knowing who drove into town. Flint sniffed the porch rail. F pointed at him. Dog looks smarter than you. He has references. For the first time, F's mouth twitched. Come in. The house smelled like coffee, wood smoke, and old lake gear. Photographs covered one wall, boats, docks, men standing beside machinery, younger faces with stronger backs. Cullen noticed Cedar Crown immediately. Not the forest-covered wreck he knew. The ship in the photograph was still mostly intact, its hull streaked with rust, but its superstructure clean enough to catch light. F followed his gaze. You've been aboard. It was not a question. Yes, the old man's face closed. You shouldn't have. A woman was trapped inside. Something moved behind F's eyes. Fear, not surprise. He lowered himself into a wooden chair near the window. Who? Nora Keene, hydrologist. Alive? Yes. F looked down at his hands, large hands once, now knuckled with age. That ship should have been cut apart 30 years ago. Why wasn't it? Money. Lawyers, owners changing names. Same reasons ugly things survive anywhere. Cullen sat opposite. Were you there the night it grounded? F stared toward the lake. For almost a minute, he did not answer. Flint settled quietly beside Cullen. Finally, F said yes. Cullen waited. The old man looked at him. Your military was? Navy? Yes. Then you know there's a difference between a ship being lost and a ship being put somewhere. Cullen felt the room change. What are you saying? F stood. He crossed to an old sea chest beneath the far window. Flint watched but did not move. The chest belonged to F, and whatever was inside it belonged to memory, not scent. F opened the lid. He removed folded canvas, an old cap, several coils of rope too small to be useful. Then he lifted a false wooden. Beneath it lay a metal service tag, faded Polaroids, and a folded sheet of paper browned at the edges. He handed the tag to Cullen. Stamped into it were the words, Hold 4, Emergency Isolation. Cullen looked up. F's voice had become quieter. Cedar Crown didn't wander into that bay. The first Polaroid showed several men beside an open cargo access. Among them stood Captain Silas Merritt. He had been somewhere in his late 40s in 1987. A tall, lean man with a narrow, weather-beaten face, straight nose, deep-set gray eyes, and dark hair already receding and silvering above the ears. A trimmed dark gray mustache gave him an austere look that the photograph softened only slightly. Even frozen in a Polaroid, he held himself with the contained posture of a career lake captain who expected competence from everyone around him and offered the same in return. F tapped the image. Silas Merritt. Hard man to work for. Fair man to work for. Those aren't the same thing. What happened? Cullen asked. F lowered himself again. They developed a problem in Hold 4 before reaching Copperwake. Tank or containment unit. I never knew exactly which. Crew reported a leak. Company told them to keep moving toward open lake. They were supposed to pass through deeper water before heading toward their next unloading point. F stared at the photograph. Merritt wanted inspection. Company wanted distance. Nora had joined them after finishing at the archive with Dana, and now stood near the kitchen doorway listening. Why would the company resist inspection? F looked at her. Because somebody had loaded more concentrate than the papers said. Nora's expression sharpened. You knew that? I knew people were whispering it. F touched the old service tag. Merritt figured if the containment failed out deep, they might never recover half of it. In a shallow bay, they could isolate the compartment, unload what they could, and reach the ship. So he grounded Cedar Crown deliberately, Cullen said. F nodded. Controlled grounding, not pretty, not gentle, but deliberate. F unfolded the old crew notice. Most of the type page contained ordinary instructions, valves, watch assignments, emergency stations. But someone had written across the bottom in blue ink, a short line, 0210, turn her toward shore, Hold 4 isolated. Beneath it were two initials. SM. Cullen stared at the handwriting. Something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the lake. One decision, made in incomplete information. A man choosing a course that might destroy his career because the alternative felt worse. The warrant arrived just after sunrise. Sheriff Dana Kittredge read it twice before closing the folder. The order covered Cedar Crown, the unauthorized pump route identified in the investigation, the settling system on Ironcrest property, and any records reasonably connected to the suspected unlawful discharge and the assault on Nora Keene. It did not give them permission to tear the ship apart. It gave them permission to look. On a 40-year-old grounded freighter, Cullen suspected looking would be dangerous enough. He stood near the shoreline access while Dana coordinated the entry team. The morning was clear again after the previous day's gray weather. Sunlight moved through the birches surrounding Cedar Crown, turning their early yellow leaves nearly translucent. Beyond the rusted hull, Lake Superior lay blue and deceptively calm. Flint stood beside Cullen in his coyote brown working harness. The 7-year-old German shepherd watched the arriving vehicles without anxiety. His black saddle caught the morning light, while the tan fur along his chest and legs seemed almost copper-colored against the ship's rust. He had been quieter since the investigation intensified. Cullen noticed things like that. People often assumed working dogs showed stress by barking or pacing. Flint did neither. He became more economical, fewer unnecessary movements, longer pauses before committing to a scent, more frequent glances toward Cullen. It was not fear. It was concentration. A dark blue pickup stopped near the sheriff's vehicles. The man who climbed out was Reed Mallory. At 54, Reed had the thick, durable build of someone who had spent decades climbing ladders, crossing wet decks, and leaning into cold wind rather than sitting behind a desk. He stood about 5'11", broad through the upper body, with a square face and wide forehead beneath short salt and pepper hair. His blue-gray eyes had the measured quality of a man accustomed to inspecting things other people preferred to call safe. He was clean-shaven, and years of working around open water had left a permanent reddish cast across his cheeks and nose. He wore a navy blue utility jacket over a steel blue work shirt, dark khaki trousers, waterproof brown boots, and a digital outdoor watch. A pair of small reading glasses rested inside his breast pocket. Reed walked toward Cedar Crown, stopped, and looked up. For almost 30 seconds, he said nothing. Then he muttered, "That's a lot of bad decisions stacked on top of old steel." Cullen glanced at him. "Professional assessment? Free version." Dana approached. "Reed Mallory, former Coast Guard Marine Safety Chief. He's consulted on grounded vessels, industrial casualties, and 2 wreck removals on the Great Lakes." Reed extended a hand. "Vale." Cullen shook it. "You know me? Small town, that answer's getting old. Move somewhere bigger." Cullen almost smiled. Reed looked down at Flint. "And this is the dog who keeps making people look slow. He enjoys the work." Flint stared at Reed. Reed nodded to him solemnly. "Same." Nora arrived a few minutes later, wearing the same mustard-brown waterproof jacket and charcoal hiking pants she had worn throughout the investigation. Her chestnut-brown hair was tied low behind her neck, though a few strands had already escaped around her freckled face. Her ankle was still supported, and she moved carefully in her dark brown hiking boots, but her green-hazel eyes looked far more alive than they had when Cullen first found her. Dana frowned at the ankle. "You sure?" "No." "That's reassuring. I can stand, test water, and irritate contractors. Those are my current qualifications." Reed looked at her. "Hydrologist?" "Yes." "Good, I know ships. You know what comes out of them." Cullen said, "And I'm here for moral support." Reed gave him a slow look. "You're here because you've already been inside twice and apparently have no healthy fear of confined steel spaces. Also moral support." Dana cut in. "Enough." She pointed toward the vessel. "No one moves beyond the cleared route without Reed approving the structure. Flint stays with Cullen. He's being used for scent and environmental behavior only, not to magically certify anything." Cullen nodded. "Agreed." Dana looked directly at him. "Especially you. I heard you the first time. I've met former special operations people." That sounded prejudiced. That was experience. Before anyone entered, Reed spent nearly 40 minutes outside. He studied old structural plans, inspected visible deformation along the hull, and used a long-handled hammer to sound sections of accessible plating near the service entrance. Cullen watched him work. Reed did not move like a man searching for danger. He moved like a man expecting deterioration and simply determining where it had chosen to hide. "People talk about old ships like they're either safe or collapsing," Reed said without looking up. "They're not? Steel doesn't care about categories." He struck another section. The sound changed. Reed stopped. "This plate still has body." He shifted 4 feet and struck again. A flatter, thinner note answered. "This one doesn't." Cullen looked at the distance between them. "That small a difference?" "Sometimes smaller." Reed turned. "Cedar Crown's been grounded almost 40 years. One section may be supported by gravel and old framing. Another may be hanging across a void with corrosion working from both sides." He pointed toward the upper deck. "So no, it's not going to suddenly fold itself in half because a squirrel sneezes, then toward a lower passage. But you can still fall through a floor that looked perfectly respectable 5 seconds earlier." Cullen absorbed that. He had spent years entering buildings where threats carried rifles. Cedar Crown had no need for one. Gravity was enough. When the team finally went inside, Reed led the structural route. Cullen and Flint followed, then Nora and Dana. One county deputy came behind them, a lean man in his early 30s with close-cropped blonde hair and a calm, attentive manner, carrying evidence gear rather than a weapon in his hands. They stayed within the section previously used by Cullen until Reed diverted them around a badly corroded stairwell. The ship smelled different in daylight, less haunted, more industrial. Cullen saw mineral deposits around pipe joints, fresh tool marks, tags placed by salvage crews, and newer cables tied neatly along older brackets. The contrast made the illicit work harder to isolate. Ironcrest had been legitimately working here. Someone had simply taken legitimate infrastructure farther than the paperwork allowed. Flint stopped near a doorway, not dramatically. One front paw simply remained suspended before touching the next section of deck. Cullen stopped with him. Dana nearly walked into his shoulder. "What?" "Flint doesn't like it." Reed stepped forward. "What did he indicate?" "Nothing specific." Cullen looked at the German Shepherd. He changed. Reed did not laugh. He took a thin steel-sounding rod from his kit and tapped the deck from the safe side. The first strike rang. The second sounded dull. The third went through. The rod punched through the painted steel with less resistance than Cullen expected, dropping several inches before Reed caught it. Everyone went still. Reed crouched. Under deck corrosion. Nora stared at the small hole. That looked solid. Paint is optimistic. Cullen looked at Flint. The dog's ears remained forward. No triumph. No performance. Just information. Cullen felt something old inside him loosen by a degree. Not because Flint had been right. That idea was too simple. Flint had sensed a change Cullen could not yet explain. Reed had tested it. Evidence had followed. Signal. Interpretation. Verification. In that order. For years Cullen had lived as though there were only two choices. Trust instinct blindly or wait until certainty arrived. Standing over rotten steel in the belly of Cedar Crown, he realized there had always been a third. Listen first, then confirm fast. He rested 2 fingers briefly against Flint's harness. Good catch. Flint looked up, then yawned. Reed glanced over. He seems overwhelmed by praise. He has standards. That small moment carried them forward. They rerouted around the weak deck, and 20 minutes later, the illegal system finally stopped hiding. Nora found the first mismatch at an old bilge manifold. A new reinforced hose had been connected through a reducer, fitting into a line that did not appear in Ironcrest's submitted pumping diagram. She crouched, careful with her ankle. This is different. Reed studied the connection. Temporary bypass. Where does it go? Let's find out. They followed it down 1 level, then through a narrow utility compartment where the hose disappeared behind a bulkhead. Outside the ship, Dana had a deputy trace the route from the settling pond side. The 2 ends matched. Nora inspected a small sampling valve in the system and took a controlled sample using fresh gloves and labeled containers. She compared it with a second sample taken from the approved discharge line. Her expression changed. What? Dana asked. Nora held both containers against the light. You won't see it visually, then why are you looking? Habit, she capped them. The permitted system has treatment upstream of the sampling point. This bypass joins after treatment. Reed frowned. So anything coming through here skips part of the process. Not entirely. Nora pointed toward another line. Look, a clean water feed joined the bypass shortly before the monitoring port. Cullen understood before she finished. They're mixing it. Nora nodded. If the untreated stream is concentrated and you add enough clean water before sampling, the measured concentration falls. Dana's jaw tightened. Below a limit? Potentially. Can you prove it happened? Not from plumbing alone. Nora stood carefully. But this system is designed in a way that can dilute discharge before the official measurement point. That mattered. It did not prove Mitchell Rusk had ordered it. It did not prove Gavin had known what it was doing. But it turned the investigation from suspicion into machinery. Someone had built a route that was not on the permit, and someone had bothered to hide what came through it. They moved toward Hold 4. The deeper they went, the more Reed slowed them. He pointed out distortion where structural frames no longer sat perfectly vertical. He showed Cullen corrosion scale, lifting from lower bulkheads and old repair welds that had been laid over even older damage. You ever clear ships? Reed asked. Different kinds. Meaning? Smaller, faster, people shooting. Reed nodded. Easier. Cullen looked at him. You serious? No. Then Reed considered, mostly. Flint suddenly turned his head. A metallic buzzing came faintly through the deck, not machinery running steadily, intermittent, high-pitched. Cullen raised a hand. Everyone stopped. The sound came again. Bzzz. Then silence. Reed looked toward the next compartment. Grinder. Dana's posture changed instantly. There shouldn't be anyone else inside. They moved. The noise became louder. At the end of the passage was an old document storage room near the access corridor leading toward Hold 4. A shadow crossed the doorway. Dana called out. Sheriff's office. Stop where you are. The grinder stopped. For half a second, nothing happened. Then Cole Varden stepped into view. He was taller than Cullen had expected. Close to 6'2", lean but hardened by years of industrial work. His charcoal work jacket hung open over a black thermal Henley, and dark gray cargo pants were tucked over heavy black industrial boots. A charcoal knit cap covered most of his extremely short black and gray hair. His face was narrow, with a sharply angled jaw and a crooked nose that had clearly been broken long ago. Dark stubble covered his cheeks. A small scar crossed his right eyebrow. His brown eyes were cold, not wild, not panicked, calculating. In one gloved hand, he still held the angle grinder. Dana kept her voice level. Put it down. Varden looked past her. At Nora. Something passed through his face. Recognition. Nora's breathing changed. That's him. Varden took one step backward. Cullen saw the decision happen. Not surrender. Distance Cole, Dana said. Don't. Varden dropped the grinder, then ran. Cullen moved instinctively. Flint launched beside him. Varden disappeared through a side passage. Cullen reached the doorway just as orange light flashed behind him. A small tongue of flame licked up beside the locker Varden had been cutting. The grinder's sparks had caught residue near the base of the cabinet. Oil, old insulation, years of grime. The flame spread across the wall with terrifying speed. "Back," Reed shouted. Smoke rolled toward them. Varden vanished into the ship. Cullen could still pursue. He knew the route. He knew Flint could track him. Then Nora coughed behind him. The county deputy had backed toward another exit, but a section of falling insulation and smoke cut them away from Dana and Reed. Cullen turned. For 1 second, his body hated the choice before his mind made it. Target fleeing, people trapped. The old mission language rose from somewhere deep. Do not lose the objective. Then another thought replaced it. People are the objective. Flint, back. The German shepherd pivoted instantly. Cullen abandoned the pursuit. He moved toward Nora and the deputy. "Stay low." Smoke thickened above them. Nora had one sleeve pressed over her mouth. The deputy pulled at a warped door, but it would not open. Cullen joined him. Together, they hit it once. Nothing. Again, metal shrieked. Third time, the latch gave. Cold air poured through from an exterior service platform. Flint went first, then turned and waited. Cullen helped Nora across. The deputy followed. By the time Dana and Reed reached them from the opposite side, Varden was gone. Cullen stood outside the ship watching smoke push through broken windows. Dana came beside him. "You had him. For about 3 seconds, you let him go." "Yes." Dana watched Nora being checked by the deputy. "Good." That surprised Cullen. Dana looked at him. "I can find Varden later." Her eyes moved toward Cedar Crown. "I can't replace people." Cullen looked away. Something in that sentence stayed with him. The fire remained limited to 2 connected rooms. A local fire crew and marine response team cooled the metal and ventilated the compartment before Reed allowed investigators back inside. Several hours later, the document room looked blackened but intact. The locker Varden had been cutting had partially collapsed. Under it, one firefighter had noticed a rectangular metal case. Not a ship's locker, a portable survey case. Fire-resistant. Its outer label had been scorched, but Reed used a damp cloth to reveal part of the company name. North Range Environmental Services. Nora went still. "That's the firm from the preliminary 1987 sampling." Dana had the case photographed in place before it was removed. Inside were water-resistant folders, original field sheets, sampling locations, handwritten concentrations, chain of custody notes. Nora compared them with copies of the final cleanup report she had brought. The room grew quiet. "This value," she said. She pointed at a sample from beneath hold 4. "Final report says it was below the response threshold." Dana leaned closer. "And here? More than 4 times that." Another sheet. Another difference. Some sample IDs had never appeared in the final submission at all. Reed was no longer looking at the numbers. He was looking at an old sectional drawing stored beneath them. "What?" Cullen asked. Reed spread the sheet flat. "Hold 4 isn't one open compartment." He traced a line beneath the main cargo space. "There's a lower containment section below the working deck. Secondary structure, accessed through a sealed service trunk." Nora moved closer. "The final cleanup says hold 4 was emptied. The upper hold, maybe." Reed tapped the lower section. "Here." A typed notation on the final inspection copy read, "Lower containment, empty dry, permanently sealed." Reed frowned. If it was actually empty and dry, why build a bypass route pulling from below it? No one answered. Nora took a portable conductivity probe and tested residual water from the connected line. She waited. The number stabilized. Her face tightened. "This isn't normal bilge water." "How bad?" Dana asked. "I need a lab before I put a name to it." Nora looked toward the sealed bulkhead beyond the room. "But something is still contributing dissolved material." Reed studied the old drawing again. Then the temporary pump configuration. Then Cedar Crown itself, as if seeing the ship through 4 decades at once. "They dewatered around a sealed lower compartment," he said. Cullen looked at him. "Meaning?" "Meaning if that lower section still contains contaminated liquid or residue, they've changed the conditions around it. After 40 years. "Yes." Reed's expression was grim. "Something that stayed stable because nobody disturbed it may not stay stable once you start pulling water out of the spaces beside it." Dana looked toward the hull. "Accidentally?" Reed folded the drawing. "Could be." Nora looked at the unauthorized bypass. Or not. Outside, late afternoon sunlight had returned to the forest. The birches shone yellow around Cedar Crown. Lake Superior looked clean enough to drink. And beneath the rusted deck of hold 4, something the official record had declared gone was still there. Ironcrest had reached it. Whether they understood what they had touched was now the most dangerous question on the ship. By noon, the samples from Cedar Crown had stopped being merely suspicious. They had become history with numbers attached. Nora Keene stood at the long table inside the temporary evidence room at the Copperwake Sheriff's Office, comparing photocopies from 1987 with the original field sheets recovered from the fire-resistant survey case. Her injured ankles still forced her to shift her weight carefully, but fatigue had sharpened rather than dulled her attention. Several strands of chestnut-brown hair had escaped the low tie at the back of her neck, and the freckles across her lightly tanned face stood out against skin that had gone pale from too little sleep. Cullen watched her use a ruler to track columns across 2 sets of documents. Flint lay beside his boots. The 7-year-old German shepherd appeared relaxed, but Cullen knew better. The dog's dark amber eyes opened whenever a door moved, and one black ear rotated toward every unfamiliar sound in the hallway. His coyote brown harness remained on, because no one knew how quickly the investigation might move again. Sheriff Dana Kittredge stood across the table. Reed Mallory occupied the far end with an old sectional plan of Cedar Crown spread beneath his hands. Nora finally exhaled. They changed the characterization. Dana frowned. Explain that in sheriff language. The early samples identify the material in the lower containment as concentrated processing solution mixed with contaminated water. And the final report describes residual wash water. Cullen looked between the pages. That sounds less dangerous. It sounds cheaper. Nora tapped the first sheet. The concentrations in these original field samples were several times higher than the numbers used in the final cleanup summary. Not every sample was altered. Some were simply omitted. Reed glanced over, so somebody didn't invent a whole fake cleanup. No, Nora shook her head. That's what makes this believable. Dana leaned against the table. How? Most of the cargo really was removed. Most of the decontamination probably happened exactly as reported. If you falsify everything, somebody notices. If you change 3 critical conclusions inside 200 pages of legitimate work, it can disappear for years. Cullen stared at the documents. There was something almost disappointingly ordinary about it. No secret federal program, no room full of conspirators, no grand plan passed from generation to generation, just money, fear, a compromised consultant, a regional inspector who had signed the final report using numbers that should have raised more questions than they answered, and dozens of other people who had likely never known anything was wrong. Dana flipped another page. Can we prove the inspector knew the numbers were altered? Not yet, Nora said. We can prove what he signed didn't match the original field data. Reed traced the lower section of Hold 4. The bigger question is what stayed aboard. Nora turned toward him. Reed pointed at 3 marks on the 1987 plan. These access trunks were sealed after cleanup. The report calls the lower section empty and dry, which it wasn't, Nora said. Probably not. Reed looked at Cullen. Ships accumulate water. Condensation, seepage, old piping, rain entry. Even if the containment was mostly emptied, residue can dissolve again over time. So it sat there for nearly 40 years. Relatively undisturbed. Reed tapped the page. That matters more than people think. Old problems don't always become bigger just because they're old. Sometimes they become stable. And Ironcrest changed that. They started removing water from compartments around it. Reed's expression hardened. That changed pressure, buoyancy inside the grounded hull, flow paths. Somebody disturbed a system that had found its own ugly equilibrium. Nora looked down at the original sample sheet. Which means Cedar Crown wasn't poisoning Copperwake for 40 years. No. Reed folded his reading glasses. It means somebody may have woken up something that had been sleeping. Cullen glanced at Flint. The dog's eyes were open. Watching him, he hated the metaphor. Mostly because it fit. Mitchell Rusk asked to speak with Dana privately that afternoon. Dana refused the privately part. Cullen remained in the room because he had been directly involved in the rescue and subsequent discoveries. Nora stayed as the technical witness. Reed stood near the window, arms folded. Rusk entered without his usual composure. His dark brown canvas jacket was still clean, but the man inside it looked as if he had aged several years in 2 days. The reddish tan across his broad face had faded beneath exhaustion. His brown-gray hair remained combed back, though less carefully than before. The steel watch on his wrist seemed strangely polished against hands marked by old industrial scars. He shut the door. I know what you found. Dana said nothing. Rusk looked at Nora. The original sampling sheets. Yes, his jaw tightened. My father worked that cleanup. The room changed slightly. Cullen had known the fact in outline. Now Rusk made it personal. He was 28. Rusk continued. Salvage laborer. Strong enough to carry anything and stupid enough to think that meant he couldn't get hurt. His mouth pulled into a humorless smile. He came home every night smelling like diesel and lake water. Rusk stared at the tabletop. Copperwake was dying then. Mill layoffs. Dock work disappearing. Cedar Crown was a disaster to everybody outside town. He raised his eyes. To us, it was wages. Dana's expression remained neutral. That explains your father. Not you. Rusk nodded once. No, it doesn't. He sat down. For the first time since Cullen had met him, Mitchell Rusk looked like a man who no longer believed he could control the room by appearing reasonable. We got abnormal readings 3 months ago. Nora's eyes sharpened. What readings? Internal sampling from the lower pump system. Who saw them? Varden. Gavin. Me, 2 contracted lab technicians. Dana asked, and you reported them? Rusk looked at her. No. Silence filled the office. Flint remained motionless beneath Cullen's chair. Dana's voice lowered. Why? Because reporting them would have stopped the project immediately. That's the point of reporting them. I know what the point is. For the first time, anger broke through Rusk's control, then vanished. He rubbed both hands over his face. 53 direct employees, trucking contracts, equipment leases, families, Nora said, and downstream water. I thought we could contain it. You hoped. Rusk looked at her. Yes. The word came quietly. I hoped. He explained that Ironcrest had already invested heavily in Cedar Crown before the abnormal samples appeared. The company carried loans secured against machinery and future contracts. A full shutdown combined with environmental liability could destroy the business within months. Rusk had authorized continued limited dewatering while an internal solution was developed. He had told himself the water would remain inside the settling system. He had told himself the concentrations were manageable. He had told himself stopping work would hurt more people than continuing carefully. Cullen knew the structure of that logic too. Not evil, arithmetic. The kind that became dangerous when human beings started choosing which lives belonged on which side of the equation. What did Varden tell you about the bypass? Dana asked. That it moved water into the settling pond through an older route. He said treatment capacity was the problem, not contamination control. And you believed him? I wanted to. Cullen finally spoke. There's a difference. Rusk looked at him. I know. Did you tell Varden to keep Nora quiet? No. Take her camera? No. Remove documents from Cedar Crown? No. Rusk's answer came harder this time. I gave him too much authority. I let him think the project mattered more than the rules. That's mine. His eyes moved toward Cullen. But I never told him to hurt anyone. Cullen believed that Rusk believed what he was saying. That was not quite the same as believing every word. He thought of Captain Silas Merritt. One man had faced the possibility of destroying his own career and chosen to put Cedar Crown ashore because doing so reduced the danger to everyone else. Mitchell Rusk had faced the possibility of losing his company and chosen to let everyone else remain inside the risk while he tried to save it. Both men could claim they were protecting Copperwake. Only one had placed himself on the expensive side of the sacrifice. Cullen wondered whether Rusk understood that yet. Judging by his face, perhaps he was beginning to. Gavin Sloan returned before sunset, not because Dana found him, because he walked into the sheriff's office and asked for her. His forest green work shirt was wrinkled, the light brown canvas vest stained dark around the pockets. His short light brown hair looked as though he had not slept, and the stubble along his roundish jaw had thickened. Those hazel brown-green eyes that had once looked merely nervous now carried the hollow exhaustion of a man who had spent too many hours arguing with himself. Cullen was in the hallway when Gavin entered. Flint rose. This time Cullen did not interpret the dog's reaction for him. He simply watched. Flint sniffed once, recognized relaxed information, nothing more. Gavin looked at Cullen. You thought it was me? Yes. Do you still? No. Gavin nodded, but relief did not come. Maybe you should. Dana brought him into the interview room. He refused an attorney twice before Dana made clear she was not offering legal advice, and that what he said could expose him to criminal liability. Gavin understood. He talked anyway. I installed the bypass. Dana already knew part of that. Now he supplied the rest. Varden had told Gavin the lower water had been cleared for processing, but that the approved treatment line could not handle the volume without delaying dismantling by months. The bypass, Varden claimed, would simply route the same water into the settling pond faster. Gavin believed him at first. Then Gavin saw lab results. Nora leaned forward. How high? High enough, I asked him. What did he say? That the clean water feed would bring the outflow within permitted limits. Nora's face changed. He said that directly? Yes, that's dilution, not treatment. I know that now. You knew enough then. Gavin closed his eyes. Yes, the admission hurt him more than accusation might have. Dana asked, why didn't you report it? Gavin's hands tightened on his knees. My mortgage. No one spoke. My wife works part-time. My youngest is in community college. Ironcrest folds. I'm not finding another maintenance job around here paying what that one does. His voice cracked, just slightly. I kept telling myself the pond worked, that whatever was in the water was old, that Rusk wouldn't let us do something that could actually hurt anybody. Cullen heard the trap. Not I knew it was safe. Someone above me would stop it if it wasn't. The same architecture again. Different generation. Different man. Same refuge. Gavin looked toward Flint through the partially open interview room door. The German shepherd lay outside beside Cullen, head between his paws. He knew I was scared, Gavin said. Cullen frowned. What? That day at the office. The dog. Gavin swallowed. I thought he was going to tell everybody what I'd done. Despite himself, Cullen almost smiled. He doesn't do paperwork. Gavin gave a broken little laugh. Then his face collapsed into something closer to shame. That would have been easier. He looked at his hands. Do you know what I kept thinking after Nora got locked in that ship? Cullen waited. Gavin continued. If I'd spoken one day earlier, maybe Varden never panics. Maybe she never gets touched. If I'd spoken 1 week earlier, maybe nobody has to go back inside that wreck. He looked at Cullen. How late can a man tell the truth before it stops counting? The question struck Cullen with uncomfortable precision. He thought of Mac, the voicemail still waiting on his phone. Words delayed long enough to become heavier than the silence around them. Cullen answered carefully. I don't know. Gavin looked disappointed. Cullen continued. But I know staying silent doesn't make it earlier. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Gavin reached inside his vest. Not dramatically, he placed a small USB drive on Dana's table. Operating logs, pump hours, valve changes, everything I had access to. Dana stared at it. You copied company records? Yes. When? This morning. Why now? Gavin glanced toward Cullen. Because late is still different from never. Reed found the next problem in those logs. He and Nora worked through them in the conference room, while evening light faded outside. Cullen stood by the window. Dana had gone to secure additional evidence at Ironcrest. Rusk remained under instructions not to interfere with any equipment or employee records. Reed suddenly sat back. Oh hell, Cullen turned. What? Reed pointed at a column of pump totals. They didn't just dewater hold 4. Nora leaned over his shoulder. Compartments 3 starboard and 4 shore side. Exactly. Reed pulled the Cedar Crown grounding profile closer. The old freighter rested unevenly across gravel, compacted sediment, and sections of harder lake bottom. It was not floating normally. Its structure carried weight through points never intended to support it for decades. Reed explained slowly. Water inside the grounded hull was not merely unwanted flooding. Some of it had become load. Removed too much from one side, and the weight distribution changed. How much? Cullen asked. Reed entered Gavin's numbers into a calculator. His expression worsened. Hundreds of thousands of gallons over several weeks. Nora stared at the hull diagram. They lightened the shoreside compartments. Yes, what does that do? Could change how the hull bears against the bottom, more twisting through the frames around hold 4. Cullen looked toward the window. Wind had begun moving the trees outside. Could? Reed pointed at the glass. Lake decides the rest. A strong northwest system was expected overnight. Not a historic storm. It did not need to be. High sustained wind over Lake Superior could create significant waves, local water level oscillation, and repeated movement against Cedar Crown's exposed hull. Reed tapped the lower bulkhead. If this old plate starts flexing and the lower containment has liquid behind it, we may open a pathway into the bilge manifold. And then? Cullen asked. Nora answered. Contaminated water gets routes to compartments connected to the exterior pumps. Reed nodded. And potentially the lake. Cullen looked at the equipment logs. So shut everything down. Rusk made the call himself. Ironcrest crews killed the permitted pumps. One by one, status indicators went dark. Except one. The bypass continued operating. Gavin stared at the monitor. That's impossible. Apparently not, Reed said. Gavin checked the control record. His face drained of color. Varden changed it. He pointed at a manual override noted 3 days earlier. Instead of remaining fully dependent on the yard control, the bypass had been configured to continue locally. Dana asked, Can we stop it from here? No. Cut power, generator backup. Where? Gavin answered reluctantly. Pump house attached to the Cedar Crown service side. Dana looked at Reed. Can a response team reach it safely tonight? Reed looked outside. Right now? Probably. Then at the weather display, later gets worse. Dana immediately began coordinating a controlled shutdown team. She pointed at Gavin. You stay here? He nodded. Too easily. Cullen noticed. Darkness came early beneath the cloud front. By 8:30, wind moved steadily through the forest around Cullen's cabin. Birch branches brushed one another with dry, whispering sounds. Cullen had been home less than 20 minutes when Flint stood abruptly from beside the stove. The dog walked to the porch door, not tense, interested. Cullen opened it. Cold wind entered. Flint stepped onto the porch and raised his head. An engine sounded somewhere beyond the trees. A vehicle traveling the old forest road toward the Cedar Crown access. Cullen could not see it through the woods. Flint could smell what had passed. The German Shepherd moved down the steps, nose testing the air near the tire track where the road crossed the edge of Cullen's property. His body changed. Recognition. A familiar scent. Cullen crouched beside him. "Gavin?" Flint looked toward the road. Cullen called Dana. She answered on the second ring. "I was about to call you. Is Gavin with you?" Silence then. "No." Cullen closed his eyes. Dana swore quietly. "He left 10 minutes ago. Deputy thought he'd gone to the restroom. He came past my road." "Toward Cedar Crown?" "Flint thinks so." Dana did not ask how Cullen knew. Not anymore. Gavin had helped build the system. He knew the manual cutoff, and he had spent the entire day confessing that he had waited too long. Cullen understood exactly what kind of mistake a guilty man might make next. He would try to fix everything himself. They met Reed near the Cedar Crown access road 25 minutes later. The wind had strengthened. Lake Superior was no longer quiet. Waves struck the exposed side of Cedar Crown hard enough to send white spray over rocks near the bow. Reed stood beside his truck in his Navy utility jacket, studying a tablet displaying weather and structural notes. Dana arrived behind Cullen. "Response team? On the way," Reed said. "Tree down across the South Equipment Road. Heavy vehicle access is slowed." Cullen looked toward Cedar Crown. The ship seemed different at night, not more haunted, more physical. Every gust pressed against thousands of square feet of steel. Every wave transferred force into a hull already resting unevenly on the bottom. Flint stood beside Cullen, his ears lifted. Then Cedar Crown produced a sound Cullen had never heard from it before. Not the ordinary ticking of cooling steel, not wind. A long, deep groan rolled through the hull. The ground beneath Cullen's boots carried the faintest vibration. Reed stopped looking at the tablet. His face hardened. Another wave struck. Cedar Crown answered with a low metallic complaint. Cullen asked, "Is it moving?" "Everything moves." "That wasn't what I asked." Reed watched the hull. "Enough that I don't like it." Dana looked toward the dark access opening. "Gavin's probably inside." Reed nodded slowly. Then he turned to Cullen. "We are not saving that ship." Cullen said nothing. Reed's blue-gray eyes remained on Cedar Crown. "Steel can be replaced. Equipment can be replaced. Hell, most of this should been scrap years ago." The wind pressed his jacket against his body. "If Gavin went in there, we find him before this place becomes somewhere nobody can enter." Flint stepped toward the trail. Cullen looked at the dark ship, then followed. The wind reached Cedar Crown before the rain did. It came out of the northwest in long, hard pushes that bent the birches along the shoreline and stripped yellow leaves from their branches. Lake Superior, blue and almost polished only hours earlier, had turned steel gray beneath the lowering sky. Wind combed silver streaks across the surface before waves began striking the grounded freighter broadside. Cedar Crown answered each impact with sound, not the harmless ticking Cullen had heard inside the ship during warmer afternoons. These noises came from deeper places. Long groans traveled through the hull and down into the gravel beneath it. Occasionally a sharper metallic report followed, like some old joint deciding whether 4 decades of stillness had been enough. Cullen stood beneath the temporary floodlights near the shoreline command point, watching the ship. His olive-green field jacket snapped lightly in the wind. Beneath it, the red and dark navy plaid flannel was already damp at the collar. Dark green cargo pants were streaked with old rust from previous entries, and his worn brown leather boots had sunk slightly into the wet gravel. His blue-gray eyes remained fixed on Cedar Crown, while the early silver at his temples caught flashes of white light from the sheriff's vehicles. Flint stood beside him. The 7-year-old black and tan German Shepherd wore his familiar coyote brown working harness, ears raised and body angled toward the ship. Wind flattened the short fur along his chest, but his dark amber eyes stayed steady. Sheriff Dana Kittredge had turned the shore into a controlled response area. 2 county vehicles blocked the access road. Portable lights faced the ship. Reed Mallory had spread structural plans across the hood of his pickup and weighted the corners with equipment cases. Nora Keene worked near a portable water monitoring station farther downshore. Mustard brown waterproof jacket zipped to her throat as she checked readings from temporary sensors near the bypass discharge. The professional hazmat and marine response teams were coming. Eventually, a large spruce had fallen across the South Equipment Road, preventing heavy response trucks from reaching the site until county crews cleared it. Smaller personnel could approach by an alternate road, but Reed had made one point repeatedly. More people inside Cedar Crown would not automatically make anyone safer. Gavin Sloan was missing. That was the only reason Cullen was even discussing entry. Dana walked toward him, ash-brown hair streaked with gray pulled tightly behind her neck, and her tan sheriff's uniform partly covered by the dark brown duty jacket. "You understand the assignment?" Cullen looked at her. "You've explained it 4 times. I'm considering 5. Find Gavin. Come back." Dana nodded. "Not repair the ship. No, not investigate Hold 4. No, not catch Varden if you see him." Cullen hesitated half a second. Dana saw it. "Vale, find Gavin. Come back." "Good." Reed joined them. The 54-year-old former Coast Guard Marine Safety Chief looked thicker through the shoulders, in his Navy utility jacket, salt and pepper hair being whipped by the wind. His square face was more serious than usual, blue-gray eyes shifting repeatedly between the ship and a handheld structural monitor. "You've got 20 minutes before I reassess," Reed said. "And after that, if the movement gets worse, I tell you to leave. What if I'm close? You leave closer." Cullen nodded. Reed gave him a compact radio. "Nora is watching vapor and water sensors. I'm watching structure and pump behavior. You watch the dog." Flint glanced up at Reed. Reed pointed at him. "Yes, you. Try to keep him from doing anything heroic." Cullen said, "You first." The humor lasted about 1 second. Then another deep groan came from Cedar Crown. Reed looked at the hull. "Go." Cullen and Flint entered through the lakeside service route they had used before. The wind became a dull roar behind steel. Inside, Cedar Crown felt almost insulated from the weather until the ship moved. The motion was tiny, nothing like a vessel underway, just enough for Cullen to feel his balance shift before the deck stopped again. Flint felt it too. His legs widened slightly, body lowering instinctively. Cullen rested one hand against the bulkhead. "You good?" Flint looked back at him, then continued. Gavin's scent had been collected from his work vest before the search, and Flint had already encountered him repeatedly at Ironcrest. Cullen did not command the dog toward any particular theory. He let Flint work, through one passage, down a service ladder, across the edge of an old machinery space. Flint moved quickly but not recklessly, pausing at each change in air current. Then he stopped. A layer of water covered the floor ahead, less than an inch. Under Cullen's flashlight it looked almost harmless. Flint lowered his nose, immediately pulled back. The reaction was subtle but definite. Cullen touched the radio. "Reed, stop point. Lower passage, forward of old pump compartment, standing water." Nora answered instead. "Flint reacting? Yes. Do not enter it. I wasn't planning to. I've got a sensor 2 compartments away showing a rise in volatile compounds. Could be from fresh leakage mixing with old fuel residue. I can't identify it remotely. So we call it bad water. We call it unknown. Science ruins all my shortcuts." Nora's voice came through with a trace of dry amusement. "Take the higher bypass corridor." Cullen backed Flint away. They climbed. Another structural shudder traveled through the hull while Cullen was halfway up the ladder. Fine rust fell past his face. He waited. 3 seconds. Stillness returned. Then Flint pulled toward the right-hand corridor. The scent strengthened. Cullen followed. At the next junction, Flint slowed. He sniffed left, then right, returned to left, then back to right again. Cullen frowned. For a moment, the old urge to interpret instantly returned. Gavin had doubled back, or the air currents had confused the trail, or Flint suddenly stiffened. A low growl vibrated in his chest, not toward either corridor, toward a work glove lying beside the wall. Cullen recognized the charcoal fabric, not Gavin's. Varden's workers used similar equipment, but Cullen had seen that specific combination of oil, grinder residue, and old leather enough times to understand what Flint was telling him. 2 scent trails. Reed. Go. Possible second person inside. Dana broke onto the channel. "Who?" "Likely Varden." A pause. "Do not pursue. I remember." Flint chose the right corridor. Cullen followed. The passage narrowed around old pipework. Then he heard a human voice. Not words. Pain. He moved faster. "Gavin, something struck metal ahead." "Here." The answer was weak but unmistakable. Cullen rounded the final corner. Gavin lay near a partially open pump access compartment. A steel support brace had torn loose from a corroded mounting and fallen across his lower leg, pinning him against the deck. His forest green work shirt was dark with sweat beneath the light brown canvas vest, and his short light brown hair stuck to his forehead. His face had gone pale around the hazel eyes. "Don't move it wrong," Gavin gasped. "I was planning to juggle it." "Not funny." "Then you're still alive." Flint moved around Gavin, sniffing his hands and clothes. Cullen crouched. "Where's Varden?" Gavin looked toward the compartment behind him. Close. A scraping sound came from the darkness. Cullen turned his flashlight. Cole Varden sat against the opposite bulkhead, perhaps 20 feet away. The 46-year-old site foreman looked far less controlled than he had during their last encounter. His charcoal work jacket was torn at one shoulder. Blood ran from a shallow cut near the small scar crossing his right eyebrow. His narrow, angular face was gray with pain beneath dark stubble, and one black industrial boot was wedged beneath a twisted section of conduit. He held his ribs with one hand. Still, his dark brown eyes remained hard. "You followed him," Cullen said. Varden laughed once. It hurt him. He shouldn't have come back. Gavin's jaw tightened. "You weren't going to shut it down." "No. You knew the weather was coming." "I knew Rusk panicked." Varden stared at Gavin. "And you panicked harder." Cullen touched the radio. "Two injured." Gavin pinned by fallen support. "Varden injured, possible trapped leg." Dana answered immediately. "Can you extract?" "Maybe." Reed cut in. "Vale, movement trend is worsening. You've got minutes, not comfort." Cullen studied the support across Gavin. It was heavy but not impossible with leverage. Past the compartment, a narrow maintenance route continued toward the pump isolation section. He could leave both men and move. The calculation formed automatically. Time, objective, risk, probability, the language of old missions. Gavin saw Cullen looking down the corridor. The cutoff's farther in. Cullen's gaze shifted to him. "I know. If the pump keeps pulling, I know, then go." Cullen did not move. Gavin grabbed his sleeve. "I came here because of me. Don't make 3 people pay for it." Reed's voice came over the radio. "Cullen, I need a decision." For a moment, Cullen heard another voice from another lifetime. Mac, a warning, incomplete information, a route, a few minutes, then consequences. But this was not that night, and Gavin was not a variable, neither was Varden. They were men, messy ones, guilty ones, frightened ones, still men. "I made one," Cullen said. He looked at Gavin. "We're getting you out." Cullen found a length of steel pipe and wedged it beneath the fallen brace. Flint stood clear, watching. On 3, Cullen told Gavin. "You counting normal or military?" "Depends how annoying you get." "Fair." Cullen leaned his weight onto the improvised lever. The brace rose barely an inch. Gavin pulled. Pain twisted his face. "One more." The ship groaned. "Now." Cullen drove downward. The brace lifted enough. Gavin dragged his leg free and rolled away. He cried out once, then clamped his teeth shut. Cullen released the brace. "Can you stand?" "Not well." "Good enough." He helped Gavin sit against the safer side of the compartment, then looked at Varden. Varden stared back. "Don't." Cullen walked toward him. "I wasn't asking. I can move." "Then do it." Varden tried. His trapped boot did not. Cullen crouched beside the conduit. "You interfere. I leave the boot and take you barefoot." Varden looked almost offended. "Those are $400 boots." "Then cooperate." For the first time, Gavin laughed. It came out ragged. Cullen worked the bent conduit loose while Varden watched him with open disbelief. "You know what I did," Varden said. "Yes. You know she could have died." "Yes. You still came back." Cullen stopped pulling for a moment. Flint stood behind him, ears forward. Varden's question carried no gratitude, only confusion, as if mercy required innocence. Cullen looked into the other man's dark eyes. "I'm not deciding what you deserve." He pulled again. "I'm deciding who I am." The conduit shifted. Varden's boot came free. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Varden looked away. Whatever happened later, arrest, charges, judgment, none of it had been erased. Cullen had not forgiven him. He had simply refused to become the kind of man who measured whether a life was worth saving by how much he liked the person attached to it. Flint stepped close enough for Cullen's hand to brush his harness. And the moment passed. Gavin could stand with help. Varden could limp. Cullen moved both men toward a more stable junction identified by Reed over the radio. A deputy entry team had reached the outer passage and was preparing to receive them. Before Cullen turned away, Gavin caught his arm. "The pump's still going. Response team handles it. They can't from the control panel." Cullen looked at him. "What did you change?" "I didn't. Varden did." Varden leaned against the wall. "Redundant setup." "Why?" Cullen asked. "Because shutting the yard power shouldn't stop dewatering." Gavin shook his head. "You tied the local generator into the manual circuit." Varden did not deny it. Gavin looked at Cullen. "There's an isolation valve between hold 4 and the old bilge manifold." Reed immediately responded. "I see it on the sectional. If you close it," Gavin continued, "the bypass loses its feed from that branch. It won't clean anything up. But if that lower bulkhead opens, contamination can't move freely through the manifold." Nora came over the radio. "That would buy us time," Reed added, "only if the valve still functions." "Where?" Cullen asked. Reed gave directions, then paused. "Problem. Of course. The mapped access route is at the distorted bulkhead we marked yesterday. Cullen looked down the corridor.
That route is closed.
Yes. Gavin pointed weakly toward another section. Old maintenance crawl space. Reed searched the plan. Not on this version. Contractors used it years ago. Where? Gavin looked uncertain. Somewhere behind the auxiliary compartment. Flint had already moved. He sniffed the wall along the junction where Gavin and Varden had struggled. Then followed a scent line toward a section covered by a newer sheet metal panel. Cullen watched. Gavin, you been through there? Once? Months ago? Varden hesitated. Yes. Flint stopped at a narrow gap near the panel edge. Air moved through it. Cullen felt it against his fingers. The dog had not found a valve. He had found the route 2 men had used. Good enough. They removed the panel. Behind it lay a narrow crawl space. Cullen looked at Flint. Bad evening for retirement. Flint went first. The crawl space opened into a corroded valve station barely large enough to stand upright. A large handwheel sat on the manifold. Rust had fused around its stem. Reed guided Cullen through the sequence. Confirm the identification plate. Cullen wiped it clean. Hold 4 isolation. Good. Release the locking pawl first. Do not muscle the wheel until that's free. Cullen followed instructions. The pawl resisted, then moved. He gripped the wheel. Nothing. Frozen. Expected, Reed said. There should be a breaker bar clipped behind the frame. Cullen found it. Flint stood near the doorway. The ship shifted. Harder this time. A pipe above them snapped sideways with a deafening clang. Cullen ducked. Flint tried to move at the same instant. A torn metal bracket swung loose and scraped across the dog's right rear leg. Flint yelped. Cullen dropped the breaker bar. Flint. The dog stumbled. For Cullen, everything else disappeared. He knelt immediately. The cut was shallow but bleeding along the outer rear leg. No obvious fracture. Flint tried to stand forward again. No, the dog resisted. Stay. Flint looked toward the valve, then at Cullen. For years, Cullen had admired dogs like Flint, partly because they worked through pain. That admiration now tasted different. A living creature's willingness to continue did not make continuing the right decision. Cullen pulled a compact first aid wrap from his field kit. Reed spoke over the radio. Status? Flint's cut. Minor, I think. Need extraction? Cullen checked the leg again. Flint bore weight. No instability. Not yet. He wrapped the wound carefully. Flint tried to move before Cullen finished. I said stay. The dog's ears lowered slightly. Cullen almost laughed. You're terrible at retirement. Only after the bandage was secured did Cullen retrieve the breaker bar. He would not trade Flint's safety for 30 seconds. Not anymore. They worked the wheel together in the sense that Flint remained beside him while Cullen strained against the bar. Once. Nothing. Again. Rust cracked. The wheel shifted. Movement, Cullen reported. Keep it controlled, Reed said. Cullen pulled. Quarter turn half. Full. The old valve protested every inch. Then the resistance changed. Reed's voice sharpened. External flow just dropped. Nora followed. Discharge conductivity is falling. Cullen gave the handwheel the final turn. It seated. Closed. Outside pressure readings began stabilizing. The emergency was not over. The contamination remained. The ship remained unstable. But they had bought time. Cullen rested his forehead briefly against the cool steel, then stood. Let's go home. Flint turned toward the crawl space, stopped, sniffed, then looked toward a side compartment. Cullen sighed. No. Flint moved anyway. Of course. The scent led only a few yards. Inside the adjacent compartment, Cullen saw fresh tool marks around a false metal panel. Varden's. Someone had been trying to open it. He radioed Dana. I have possible evidence. Adjacent valve station. Photograph. Don't disturb more than necessary. Cullen documented the panel before easing it open enough to inspect behind it. A waterproof document case sat inside. Old. Sealed. Protected behind decades of steel. He removed it carefully and opened only the outer latch once Dana authorized him to verify contents. Inside were preserved crew statements, logbook pages, photographs of Hold 4, and a sealed recording cassette wrapped in protective material. Cullen did not touch the cassette. He did not try to play anything. A handwritten line marked the inside lid. The ink had faded but remained readable. If this survives, tell them why we turned her toward shore. Cullen stared at the words. Captain Silas Merritt had written them nearly 40 years earlier. Outside, the wind hammered Cedar Crown. But for the first time, Cullen did not hear only an old ship under strain. He heard men who had once made a decision no one had understood, and somewhere inside that case they had finally left behind their own voice. Copperwake did not wake the next morning feeling saved. It woke tired. The wind had weakened before dawn, leaving Lake Superior restless but no longer violent. Broken birch branches littered the forest roads, yellow leaves stuck to wet gravel, and Cedar Crown rested in its shallow bay beneath a washed blue sky, as if nothing extraordinary had happened inside it. But the town knew. By 8 o'clock, state environmental vehicles were parked beside county cruisers near the shoreline. Temporary fencing went up around the salvage site. Pumps were shut down or placed under outside control. Specialists began taking new water and sediment samples, while structural engineers marked sections of Cedar Crown that no one would be allowed to enter again without reinforcement. The ship had survived the night. That did not mean it had been saved. Cullen Archer Vale stood near the edge of the restricted zone with Flint beside him. The German shepherd's right rear leg was wrapped in a clean veterinary bandage. The cut from the broken bracket had required several stitches but no deeper repair. Flint disliked the bandage with an intensity normally reserved for vacuum cleaners and unnecessary baths. He had already tried twice to chew it. Cullen had stopped him twice. "You're retired," Cullen reminded him. Flint stared at Cedar Crown. "That means fewer industrial disasters." The dog looked up at him. Cullen sighed. "I realize I've done a poor job establishing precedent." For once there was nobody nearby to hear the joke. He preferred it that way. His olive field jacket still carried faint rust stains from the ship. Beneath it, the red and dark navy plaid shirt was clean but wrinkled from too little sleep. His worn brown boots stood in damp shoreline gravel, while his old military watch ticked toward a life he had not yet decided how to measure. 2 weeks ago, he had come to Copperwake to sell a cabin. The real estate agent had called that morning. Cullen had not answered. Ironcrest Reclamation stopped operating before noon. Not permanently, not yet. But its Cedar Crown project was suspended. Accounts related to the salvage contract were frozen for review, and state investigators began collecting company records. Some workers stood outside the Ironcrest yard, watching government vehicles move in and out. A few looked relieved. Others looked furious. A man at the diner told anyone listening that 50 families should not lose paychecks because 3 men had made bad decisions. Someone else replied that families downstream should not drink contaminated water because 50 people needed jobs. By lunchtime, they were no longer talking about water. They were talking about loyalty, about Copperwake, about outsiders, about who had known what. Truth had not united the town. It had simply given everyone something real to argue about. Mitchell Rusk experienced that consequence more quietly. Cullen saw him 2 days later, leaving the sheriff's office after another interview. The 57-year-old owner of Ironcrest looked smaller somehow, though his broad build had not changed. His dark brown canvas work jacket remained the same, his blue-gray chambray shirt buttoned neatly beneath it, but his brown-gray hair had lost its usual careful arrangement, and the permanent reddish tan across his wide face looked dull beneath exhaustion. Rusk paused when he saw Cullen. "They're probably going to tear half of her apart." He meant Cedar Crown. Cullen nodded. "Probably. My father spent 6 months cleaning that ship." "I know." Rusk looked toward the lake. "When I was a kid, I thought that wreck saved us. My old man had been laid off from the mill. Cedar Crown gave him work." His jaw tightened. "I spent my whole life thinking keeping Ironcrest alive meant keeping that kind of thing from happening again." Cullen said nothing. Rusk gave a tired laugh. "Turns out you can protect something so hard you start hurting it." There was no dramatic confession, no plea for sympathy. Investigators were examining whether Rusk had knowingly failed to report contamination data and allowed unlawful discharge practices to continue. Whatever consequence followed would belong to courts and agencies, not Cullen. Rusk looked at him once more. "Do you think Merritt would have understood me?" Cullen thought about it. "Yes," Rusk seemed surprised. Then Cullen added, "I don't think that means he would have agreed with you." Rusk absorbed the answer, then walked away. Cole Varden faced a different road. Charges related to Nora's confinement, obstruction of the investigation, evidence interference, and his actions aboard Cedar Crown were being prepared. He had been treated for his injuries and transferred into custody. Cullen did not visit him. Saving a man did not require becoming part of his redemption. Gavin Sloan was not treated as innocent either. He gave investigators the pump logs, explained how the bypass had been built, identified every valve change he remembered, and admitted that he had remained silent after he understood enough to know something was wrong. Dana told Cullen later that prosecutors would decide what weight his cooperation deserved. Gavin had asked for no guarantees. For Cullen, that mattered. Not enough to erase what happened. Enough to distinguish confession from convenience. Ephraim Boone gave his statement 3 days later. He insisted on doing it in person. At 81, he arrived at the county meeting room in his faded navy chore coat, brown and cream flannel shirt, old brown work pants, and weathered leather boots. His narrow shoulders were bent by age. White hair swept loosely backward, and his short silver beard framed a face that seemed carved by decades of wind off Lake Superior. He carried the old service tag from 1987 in both hands. Dana had arranged for the interview to be recorded formally. F stared at the microphone. "That thing going to make me sound smarter?" "No," Dana said. "Then it's defective." Nora laughed. F smiled briefly. Then he told the truth. Not perfectly, not heroically. He admitted what he remembered and what he did not. He explained that Captain Silas Merritt had ordered Cedar Crown into shallow water after the Hold 4 incident. He described the cleanup crews, the drums he saw left below, and the question he had once asked but never pursued. Then his voice began to shake. "I let people call those men fools. Nobody interrupted. For years." F rubbed one thumb across the service tag. "I knew enough to know they weren't." He looked directly toward the camera. Silas Merritt did not lose Cedar Crown. His pale blue eyes glistened. He put her where we could reach her. The room stayed quiet long after he stopped speaking. Cullen thought there were some truths that became lighter when spoken. Others became heavier first. Perhaps that was the price of carrying them honestly. The recording recovered from the watertight case took nearly 2 weeks to stabilize and transfer. No one simply pushed play on an old cassette found inside a damp wreck. The preservation specialist cleaned the housing, inspected the tape, and created a digital copy from the safest usable section. Dana arranged a small private gathering before any public release. Family representatives of Cedar Crown's former crew were invited. Cullen almost did not attend. F insisted. "You found the box. Flint found the trail. Fine. Bring the smarter veil." So Cullen came. Flint came too, bandage removed now, the dark fur on his rear leg shaved in a narrow patch around the healing wound. The meeting was held in a modest county community room overlooking the lake. Among the relatives sat Margaret Harlan, 73, the daughter of Cedar Crown engineer Thomas Harlan. She was a slender American woman of medium height with softly stooped shoulders and silver-gray hair cut neatly to her jaw. Her pale skin bore age spots across the backs of her hands, and her blue-green eyes had the watery brightness of someone determined not to cry until given a good reason. She wore a simple forest green cardigan over a cream blouse and held an old black and white photograph against her lap. Her father stood in that photograph at 37, young, smiling, standing beside Cedar Crown. Margaret told Nora before the recording began that Thomas Harlan had died 12 years earlier. He hated talking about the ship. "Because of what happened?" Nora asked. Margaret shook her head. "Because people thought they knew what happened." That distinction stayed in the room. The lights were dimmed slightly. A speaker crackled. Static. Then a man's voice emerged from 39 years away. Captain Silas Merritt sounded tired, not frightened. He spoke as a man recording something he hoped no one would ever need. The crew knew grounding Cedar Crown could cost licenses, jobs, and reputations. They knew the company would argue that they had acted outside instructions. He did not explain every technical detail. He did not accuse everyone who had failed them. He spoke mostly about the choice itself. Deep water behind them, shallow bay ahead. One place where a failure might disappear beneath Lake Superior. Another where people could still reach it. "So we turned her toward shore," Merritt said through static. A long pause followed. Then the final sentence came. "Whatever they say about us after tonight, hold fast." The recording ended. No music followed. No one moved. Margaret Harlan pressed the photograph against her chest. A small sound escaped her. Then the tears came. "My father knew." Her voice trembled. "He knew people thought they ruined that ship." F, seated across the aisle, bowed his head. Margaret wiped her face. "He never defended himself." Cullen looked toward the lake through the window. Some wounds were not caused only by what happened. Some came from living too long beneath the wrong story. Margaret rose after the room had emptied. Only Cullen, Flint, F and a few others remained. She walked slowly toward Flint. The German shepherd sat beside Cullen, watching her approach. Margaret crouched with difficulty. "May I?" Cullen nodded. She placed one age-spotted hand gently against Flint's black and tan neck. "You found them," she whispered. Cullen almost corrected her. Flint had not found Captain Merritt. He had not understood the documents. He had not known what Cedar Crown meant. But something stopped Cullen. Margaret did not need a technical answer. Flint leaned forward and rested his muzzle lightly against her wrist. The old woman closed her eyes. And Cullen suddenly understood why people sometimes called animal instinct a kind of grace. Not because animals knew the future, not because they understood human justice, but because they occasionally led people toward doors their hearts had been too frightened to open. Cullen felt the phone in his jacket pocket. Mac's voicemail was still there. For the first time, It no longer felt like evidence against him. It felt like a door. That evening, Cullen sat on the porch of his uncle's cabin. Flint slept at his boots. The lake was invisible through the trees, but Cullen could hear it. He opened Marcus Delaney's voicemail. Mac's voice filled the quiet. "Cullen, it's Mac. I'm not calling about the old days, unless you want to. I heard you're somewhere in Minnesota pretending trees count as friends. Call me when you stop being an idiot." Cullen laughed. Actually laughed. Flint lifted his head. "Don't encourage him." Cullen pressed call before he could reconsider. Mac answered on the fourth ring. "Vale? Still using caller ID?" Silence. "Then you stubborn son of a... Nice to hear you too." Mac's voice had aged, but not as much as Cullen expected. The two men spoke awkwardly at first. Weather, Minnesota. Flint. Everything except the thing between them. Finally Cullen said, "I should listen to you." Mac was quiet. "That why you called?" "No." "Good. Because I'm tired of that sentence." Cullen stared at the forest. "You told me that withdrawal route felt wrong, and I waited. You verified. I waited too long." Mac exhaled. "Cullen, we had a drone feed telling us the route was clear. Intel agreed. Half the team agreed with you. I was lead. Yes. You got hurt. Yes." Neither man softened the truth. Then Mac continued. "But do you know what I spent years being angry about?" Cullen tightened his grip on the phone. "Me? No." Mac's answer came immediately. "You disappearing." Cullen looked down. Flint opened one eye. Mac continued. "I never asked you to turn one bad night into the rest of your life." The words landed harder than accusation would have. Cullen had spent years believing guilt was loyalty, as if remaining miserable somehow honored what Mac had lost. Now he understood how selfish that could become. "I didn't know how to come back," Cullen said. Mac's voice softened. "You start by calling." Cullen looked at Flint. "I guess I just did." "Yeah." A pause. "About damn time." They did not fix everything. They talked for 43 minutes. That was enough. Months later, winter had begun threatening the edges of Copperwake. Cedar Crown was still there. Large sections had been stabilized while environmental remediation continued. Other sections were scheduled for controlled dismantling. Nobody pretended cleanup would be quick. Ironcrest remained under investigation and had been forced into restructuring. Some workers found temporary employment with remediation contractors. Others left town. Copperwake survived. Not unchanged. But towns rarely survived anything unchanged. A structurally safe portion near Cedar Crown's old bridge was preserved as part of a small memorial overlooking the bay. The ship's bell stood at its center. Beside it, a modest metal plaque carried 2 words. Hold fast, no grand monument, no mythology. Just names, dates, and the truth. Cullen never signed the papers to sell the cabin. At first, he simply postponed the appointment. Then he canceled it. He began volunteering with the county search and rescue team. Flint accompanied him during selected training work after the veterinarian cleared the healed leg. Cullen helped younger handlers understand terrain, scent conditions, and something he had once been less good at teaching, how to listen before deciding what a signal meant. Dana eventually suggested using an abandoned ranger station outside Copperwake as a training base. Reed helped inspect the building. A few veterans volunteered labor. Nora threatened to test the well water before Cullen was allowed to make coffee. Several months later, someone painted a temporary sign over the entrance. Northwatch K9 Search and Rescue. The organization was hardly more than a handful of people. Donated gear and an old station smelling of sawdust. Cullen liked it immediately. It was unfinished. So was he. One clear autumn morning nearly a year after he first arrived, Cullen walked with Flint along the old forest trail. Birches had begun turning gold again. Lake Superior flashed blue through the trees. The same road, the same season, a different man. They reached the fork. Flint stopped. Cullen recognized the place instantly. To the left, the trail descended towards Cedar Crown. Through the trees, part of the preserved bridge could still be seen above the shoreline. Flint looked that way. For several seconds he remained still. Then he turned, not toward the ship, toward Copperwake, toward the cabin, toward Northwatch, toward people who expected Cullen to return for lunch. Flint walked several yards down the trail, then stopped and looked back. Cullen stood alone at the fork. Once he had believed destiny would feel enormous when it arrived. A command, a battle, a moment obvious enough to divide life cleanly into before and after. Instead, his had arrived quietly. A dog stopping on a forest trail, a ship everyone knew about but no one truly understood. A woman beneath a deck, an old man finally speaking, a friend answering the phone. Flint waited. Cullen looked once toward Cedar Crown. Then he turned away from it. Coming, the German shepherd continued toward town. Cullen followed. The first time Flint had taken him off that trail, he had led Cullen toward something buried in the past. This time he led him the other way, toward home. Sometimes the miracles God sends into our lives do not arrive with thunder, bright lights, or answers we can immediately understand. Sometimes they come quietly through a door that opens at the right moment, through a stranger who refuses to walk away, or even through the faithful eyes of a dog who somehow senses that we are heading in the wrong direction. Cullen thought he had come to Copperwake only to close one more chapter of his life. Instead, Flint led him toward people who needed him, a truth that needed to be heard, and finally toward the part of himself he had abandoned years ago. Perhaps that is how God works more often than we realize. He does not always remove the storm. Sometimes he places someone beside us who helps us find our way through it. In our own lives, we may carry regrets that no one else can see. We may believe a mistake has defined us, that too much time has passed to make things right, or that the road ahead has nothing left for us. But as long as we are still here, there may still be another conversation to have, another person to forgive, another truth to tell, another hand to reach for, and another road God has not finished showing us. So if you are carrying something heavy today, remember this. Your past may explain where you have been, but it does not have to decide where you are going. Sometimes faith means taking one more step before we can see where the path leads. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need this message today. And tell us in the comments, have you ever felt that God used a person, an animal, or an unexpected moment to guide you when you needed it most? If you enjoy stories of courage, loyalty, second chances, and the extraordinary bond between Navy SEAL veterans and their K-9 partners, please subscribe to K-9 Navy SEAL Stories and join us for the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, give you strength for the burdens you carry, and place faithful companions beside you on every road ahead. And wherever life leads you, may you always have the courage to hold fast.